Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Digital Tools for Green Building Designs webinar, organised by Share Your Green Design, the Centre for Science and Technology Innovations, and the Kenya Green Building Society. My name is Niall. I'm here on behalf of Share Your Green Design, and I'll be hosting today's session. We've a great series of events lined up over the coming weeks on topics such as digital twins and sustainable materials. But for this first session, we're going to focus on whole life carbon, considering carbon emissions not only during the building's use, but also during design, construction, use, and disposal. We've got a great series of speakers lined up here today. We've got Cecilia Wandiga from the Kenya-based Centre for Science and Technology Innovations. We've got Rachel Matheo from the Kenya Green Building Society, Juan Morales from Share Your Green Design, Stephen Barrett from the Irish Green Building Council, Kelly Alvarez Duran from the University of Toronto, and Adam Osinski from the Environmental, excuse me, the joys of live television, and Adam Kaczynski from the environmental engineering firm Atelier 10. I want to thank all the speakers for being here today and joining us for their perspectives and insights. Just a quick reminder to everybody watching live on YouTube, you can write and submit questions to us in the YouTube live chat feature at any time during the discussions. And with that, I'm going to hand you over to Cecilia from the CSTI for our first talk. Take it away, Cecilia.
This webinar, we're very excited to be here, and give me a second to share the screen. So we're here. One of the things we want to do is put this discussion, whole life carbon, in context of what it means for development in Africa, especially building construction. Of course, there's rising income, and with that, there's corresponding ability to create new infrastructure. And what we want to say is, as we're doing that, what we want to do is avoid these high carbon pathways. So we want to get as industrialized as everybody else, but we don't want to be sort of the big segment on the graph in terms of emissions. As now that we know how to monitor them and how to separate them out and use different methods for mitigation during construction techniques, what we're hoping is we'll be at least carbon neutral. If we're able to do a lot of innovation, we can even be carbon negative, which means our processes for construction actually emit less carbon than is used in production and absorb some of the carbon. So looking at the actual numbers, yes, there is increasing in emissions, and we can see here in data about, which is pretty high, about 61% of final energy use and 32% of carbon dioxide emissions related to the construction sector in the African building sector. So if we're looking at the total amount of emissions in Africa, this is what it really means is the construction sector is consuming not only a lot of energy, but also emitting a lot of carbon dioxide. And that's something that we want to sort of change that path a little. And the way to do this is looking at decarbonizing buildings, which seems kind of abstract. So we're going to take a deeper dive into what that means. This side, tropical buildings are sort of just have different needs because of the different climate zones. So here what we're doing is looking at post-construction, which means after the building is built and operational, how do we make sure that emissions remain low? And one of the things is to take advantage of airflow and look at how we design the use of balconies. Instead of having small balconies, can we have the same living space, but have a larger balcony, because when you have that and you have that as a living space, you can have sort of your bigger open windows, and that can bring airflow into the space in a massive way. The facades here, you see that instead of trying to do having a large window like this that would take up the whole facade, you make smaller windows, and probably if you can have each one of these panels here become workable panes, then you can decide, depending on the airflow that day, you can decide how to open this one and the lower one and keep these two closed, and give the end user consumer some more ability to have maximum type of climate control without having to trigger air conditioning systems. Mosquito screens, of course, are necessary for tropical climates. On this lower side, you can see there needs to be, we always think about space for parking, but what about space for bicycles and electric scooters? Down here is walkways where they're big enough so that you can, if you have family of 5 walking, or you have multiple people going that way, you have ample room for human traffic. You have lots of plants to be able to absorb the carbon, and as carbon sinks, that's called insetting. Think about how the building is oriented. How much sunlight, how much heat do you need to capture from the sun? And how do you situate the building to maximize the sunlight and minimize the need for heating at night or heating storage or things like that? Looking at shared stacks, you always have some kind of emissions in that. Can you recapture that? And some of that CO2 from different activities, some kind of combined heat steam, combined heat power. If there's kitchen activity, if it's a mixed use, let's say there's a restaurant or some other laundry facility type establishment in the mixed use facility, then you can capture some of that and redistribute that for boiler heat. And of course, the VOC cladding, low volatile emission chemicals, and looking at the type of building face material that absorbs heat and doesn't reflect radiation back into the surrounding atmosphere. And when we're talking emissions, it's also important to realize that during the construction phase, so this is prior to the construction, we have emissions that we need to look at: the transportation distance, the type of materials, does glass versus cement versus using clay, or this, what type of emissions, how much energy does it take in terms of the manufacturing process of each one of those. And then we also look at disposal and reuse of materials. So disposal on site during the construction, but then as the building repair, or if the building needs to get torn down, how much energy and emissions are generated when we're doing those processes of disposal and reuse of material. And one of the things to keep in mind, dust particles, they are fine particle matter count in emissions as well. And of course, none of these are visible, which is the challenge that we have when we're measuring emissions. Looking at ways in which we can decouple, you have looking at during the planning phase. Of course, new buildings, it's easier than the existing buildings. Building operations is a key area. I think that everybody could focus on, like, how do you design the building so that the operation of the building is low emission? The type of appliances and systems, energy savings, we've already started doing that in the African context, make more emphasis on those bringing in or using those types of appliances. And then the materials themselves, we discussed that in the previous slide. And looking at, when we say resilience, looking at the ability to recover from climate-related damages. If there's flooding, if there's sudden high heat, if there's drought, those put kind of tensions not only on the building, but the building operation itself. So how do we design either capture for water or things that storage, that we can manage those kinds of variations. And then, of course, clean energy, which means not just renewable, but looking for the types of energy sources that emit the lowest emissions. And there are benefits to this, lower interest rates, because you're reducing the greenhouse gases. In the European market, if you're using this type of materials, they'll sort of be more affordable for the consumer because there's no carbon tax. Emissions have a negative impact on biodiversity. So looking at the impact on not just wildlife, but also plant life. And wildlife, we even mean frogs, insects, that kind of thing. And making sure that there's evidence to back when we say we have a green building and we've achieved the standard. It's not just because, we want to say that we do. We actually want to be able to have data that others can check, and using the same method, they'd be able to verify and say, yeah, it's like saying I have a red car and somebody looks and they look at it and it looks red to them too. It doesn't look like a purple car or a green car or a yellow car. So that's what we want on the emissions. This is looking at how do you track post-consumer, and the fact that we need to get into this data tracking. We need to put systems in our buildings that enable us to track energy hotspots so that regardless of how well we thought we designed something, we can always improve. And either building improvement, behavioral changes, or in the next phase of designing. The way to do that, capture that data and share it and analyze it, is looking at building information models, which are not new to the African sector, which is good. And you can see here, there's already been a survey from 2020, and it shows that there's a high level of awareness, 90.44, almost 91% have looked at and know how to use the building information model for design, for construction. Now what we want to do is look at, can we use this for sharing data and getting together in collaborative spaces? How do we do collaborative planning, which means if we start sharing data from different buildings, what about privacy standards? Does that start signaling, like, for example, you don't want to have sharing from a manufacturing facility that everybody knows, oh, this is when they're running their production line, but you do want to know when that manufacturing facility has peak energy so that you can then see what kind of surrounding competing uses can offset that. So it's not just looking at the building, but everybody as a community, as a village, being able to adjust. So how do we share without disclosing sensitive information? Climate modeling scenarios, we all know weather patterns vary, so we also don't want to share a climate model's prediction and then it be wrong, and the behavior that it triggers emissions reaction in the wrong direction, or triggers behavior modification in the wrong direction. Manipulation, we also don't want the information falling into sort of a monopolistic scenario where consumers then have to say, oh, we're only using this type or this type because the data says that whoever controls the data is driving us in one direction or another. And then looking at environmental justice. So the more transparency we have, the more sort of not only marginalized groups, but communities are able to react and say what it is that they want to do in terms of making sure there's environmental justice for everybody. These are sort of the big trends in digitalization. So looking at Construction 4.0, when you're looking at that building information model, these are the different data points that those BIM models can turn into. And you'll see that over the course of this webinar series. Different speakers will present on how that actually works. Looking at a contextual understanding of digital tools, what we want to do is increase the performance metrics in a way that we can link to, are we making a measurable difference in the sustainability of African construction practice? And also the quality and affordability from the consumer perspective. And if we can, when we go into digital twins, we'll be able to see how can we model, like how can we create the ideation of what a future African city look like in scenarios before we actually start building it. And overall, what we're going to do through this webinar series is present case studies, best practices, know that this is an emerging field, and we're going to have collaboration peers, sort of be a place where you can come together and discuss these things and be looking at how we can build capacity. And you can feel free to ask us in terms of training that could be available. And we'd love to be able to engage with everybody on joint projects. And on that line, I'll turn it over to Rachel. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Cecilia. Next up, we've got Rachel from the Kenya Green Building Society.
Thank you so much, Niall. I do hope that my is visible. Let me just make it wholly visible. Just to add on to what Cecilia, it is a crucial time to be having this discussion. It's the whole life to the built environment, especially me being from the Kenya Green Building Society, which, just as a means of introduction, is a non-profit member-based organization that was established to lead the transformation of the Kenyan construction industry towards sustainability. And we don't act independently. We are a member of the World GBC. So we definitely have the capacity and the mandate not to ensure that there's a lot of capacity within our network, both local, regional, and global, so that everyone going into the project knows that we are not just looking at particular segments of the project, but we are looking at entire life cycle carbon that is going into the project. So pre-planning into the construction and during the operational phase, as well as how you're going to maybe demolish and just the general afterlife. Today, in my introduction, I just want to give a brief introduction to some of the activities stroke interventions that we do as the Kenya Green Building Society to help develop the Kenyan market so that it can be able to take up more sustainability practices and just enable the market to be ready for products and services that are more sustainable and not just business as usual. So on the screen, we can see our activities, which mainly look at advocacy, education, certification, innovation, and collaboration. And for the purpose of this series of webinars, we, as KGBS, the team from KGBS hopes to showcase the tools and products that assist in this sustainable development of our built environment. And just as a way of highlighting them, we do have our Jenga Green Library, which is a green products, green materials and services directory for bringing for the availability of a one-stop shop within the Kenyan environment, that anyone within the development space, be it a home developer, a home builder, that is, or a developer who wants to see, okay, I do want to bring up a sustainable project. What do I need to have in my project? Who are the people who are going to help me achieve this? And what are the materials that I'm going to use that are going to be sustainable as part of making the entire project more sustainable as compared to just using what is conventional in the practice. So I definitely look forward to interacting more with everyone on this. And talking about other interventions that I'll just quickly mention. We have our carbon offsets portal that's available on our website to help anyone looking to get their to net zero or their projects to net zero, an ESG framework and an alternative building materials report also coming up. But for the sake of this webinar series, we will be talking more about the Jenga Green Library in the third session. So for now, that has been my time, and I look forward to interacting with everyone. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you for that, Rachel. Next up, we have Guan from Share Your Green Design.
Hello, good afternoon. So first of all, it's a pleasure to be here talking about Whole Life Carbon, because this is an initiative we've been discussing with, it started with Cecilia maybe 2-3 months ago, and then we talked about how we could help to bring awareness on Whole Life Carbon, and she was very keen to talk about digital tools, and that's why we put together this series of webinars, which also follows a storyline that Niall mentioned earlier. So there is a sequence, and we hope it's helpful. So on today, we are going to be, as we are focusing on Whole Life Carbon, I'm going to briefly talk about a quick overview of the Whole Life Carbon, and also why we founded Share Your Green Design and what we want to do about it. So give me just 1 sec to share my screen, please. So I'm going to start with something that maybe is a bit too detailed, but it's important to understand what we are talking about. So what is the average carbon emissions per person per year, which is something that maybe not many of you have thought about. So according to a book published in 2000, so it's a bit out of date, but it's a very interesting book, and I always recommend it because it's very easy to read, and it gives a lot of data, but in a way that's easy to understand. So the average per person at the time in 2000, with 6 billion people, the worldwide population, it's higher now, as we know, it was 5 tons of CO2, which it sounds like a lot, but to put it into context, if we know what is the volume of 1 ton of CO2, so we are talking about something like that size. So if we think that each of us worldwide is emitting 5 of those balloons, then we have a better idea of the kind of challenge we are all facing. As we see there, that's the 5 we were talking about. But if we look at it in more detail, again, this is an extract from the same book, not all the regions in the world are emitting at the same level, because 5 is the average. But if you look here on the bottom side, there are regions like Asia and sub-Saharan Africa that are emitting below that 5, and there are others here on the left that are emitting above, which is also important for the context. And then another one I found, I always find very interesting, is the historical responsibility. So again, to the left, because this is not currently, this is what has happened since it started to be measured, I think in 1880. So we see on the left that there is a few countries, and again, don't forget that's about this per person per capita. Now, if we move into the construction, so what is the average embodied carbon for a residential building? That's something, according to the RIBA, it's around 1,200. So business as usual, as you can see here, they have 3 columns. Business as usual, this would be in the UK, sorry. Business as usual would be 1,200 kilos of CO2 a square meter. And the target for 2025 would be 800, 2030, 625. But there are other studies that say that those figures are a bit too high, and the actual business as usual is a bit lower. But anyway, if we assume that is 1,000 kilos per square meter, that means that a house with an area of 100 square meters emits 100 of those balloons that we saw earlier. So if you think about a house of 100 square meters, it doesn't sound like a lot. If you think of 100 of those balloons, then that puts that into context. And this is all the embodied carbon, because we'll talk, there are people talking after that know more about this than I do, but as you know, the embodied carbon is solely from manufacturing, so before even manufacturing, from the structure of the materials from the quarry until we finish the house. Then we have the operational carbon, which is on top of this figure. But this is just to put it into context and also to raise awareness on the importance of embodied carbon. Now, how does a sustainable building look like? That's when we started with zero green design, because we thought exactly that. Is as architects, I forgot to say earlier that I'm an architect and I work as an architect at BDP. So it's when we are designing, is how can we make our buildings more sustainable? And that's when it gets more complicated, because there is a lot of information. There is, but there is not enough data, we think. So that's why we launched Zero Green Design, which started as a blog, let's say, and then it became quickly a website as we started bringing more collaborators in the team. And the main idea was we need to share sustainable projects, but we also need to share data, because to judge whether a building is sustainable or not, we think data helps a lot, because otherwise we would be just making claims that no one can verify. So if we go to this one, for example, that's just a school in Denmark, and they sent to us the embodied carbon. So if you look at it here on the right, on the bottom right corner, it's 354 kilos of CO2 per square meter. So that's much lower than the figure we talked about earlier. But that is a building made with a timber structure, and the steel is 3. So that means that it's a considerable amount of embodied carbon. But anyway, that's the kind of data that we can evaluate whether the building is sustainable or not. This one is well below the average, so it would be a sustainable building. But then there are many different ways of designing a sustainable building. This one in particular in Bangladesh, it's all made with bamboo and natural materials, so we don't need a life cycle assessment to confirm that this building is sustainable, because we can tell straight away it's sustainable. This one here, it's in Switzerland. Again, it's a completely different design. It's a modular construction made of timber, and it's a temporary building for 10 years, and it was done modular because it would be relocated somewhere else in the future. This one is in China, and it's all done mainly with stone from local stone. This one is in Japan, and it's an interesting one that actually Naya wrote about. It's all made with materials it's a circular building, so it's all parts from demolished buildings. This is another way that's a very sustainable way of construction, which is retrofitting existing and old and derelict buildings, because they are already there, and so the building that less carbon emit is the one that already exists. It doesn't have to be that kind of buildings, old and derelict, as I said earlier. They could be buildings built in the 70s, in the 80s, or even in the 90s that, for some reason, they don't serve the purpose they were built for, and then we can retrofit them and change their use as well. This was one in South Africa. That's a very interesting one, using Ram Earth. This is a 3D printed building. That's a prototype, but it's another one that looks very promising and a way to reduce carbon emissions as well. But then we thought as well, when we started, even though Zero Green Design started as a database for case studies, we thought it would be interesting to include students' projects, because the build projects that we are being finalized now, they are built now, they were designed 5, 6, 10 years sometimes ago. So those sustainable principles might not be incorporated fully. But the students are maybe in this case ahead of the industry, not maybe, I'm sure they are ahead, at least some of them. And they are producing already fantastic design, like this one by Daniele Gregorio, who joined our team after we published a couple of her projects. Then we said as well, it's not only about that, we also need research, and we need to understand, we want to give visibility to the fantastic work that researchers are doing worldwide, and usually that research stays only within the researchers' circle. So we wanted to give them visibility. We also help to somehow digest them and give them the recognition they deserve. And then we thought that there are plenty of news daily So what we do is also curate and have a look to press worldwide, and we make a selection of what we think is more relevant for our audience. And then maybe a few weeks ago, we also decided that we had a fantastic team at Zero Green Design, and some of them are really good writers as well. It would be good to have our own green thoughts so we can explain what we think about this. Then we also started the podcast channel, so that's something that we started maybe 4 or 5 months ago. And Naya, who is the host today, is also the host for the podcast, and he's already recorded, I think, 8 or 9. You can correct me later, Naya. And they are already on YouTube and Spotify, and they will be on the website very soon. So as a summary, just to finish with this, there are no silver bullets. So if we have learned something over these years, and in my particular case, doing a lot of research and study, that there are no silver bullets. As Cecilia mentioned earlier, we have to pay attention where the buildings are located, the local climate conditions, the materials available, and we can't just export something that's done in a country to another one because it's completely different. So my view is that we need more education. So we need to upskill the construction. So starting with the designers, but then follow with all the stakeholders. We need more data. So following that education, we need that data, and we need to share that data. And I think we need plenty of common sense to then use that education and that data in a meaningful way. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Guan, and also thank you to Rachel and Cecilia for those 3 introductions. We're going to move now to the first main talk of the webinar, which is from Stephen Barrett from the Irish Green Building Council. Just a reminder, after Stephen's talk, which will last approximately, I think, 30-35 minutes, we're going to pause for a questions and answers session where we're going to invite back Cecilia, Rachel, Guan, and Stephen as 4 panelists. So feel free to submit questions via the YouTube live chat over on the Share Your Green Design YouTube channel. And with that, we'll hand you over to Stephen Barrett.
Hi, everybody. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully you can see that. Somebody say yes. I'm Stephen from the Irish Green Building Council. Like the Kenyan Green Building Society, we're a non-profit member organisation whose aim is to help the Irish construction sector to build better, more environmentally friendly buildings. I look after our whole life carbon projects and generally try to get people to see things from this more holistic point of view. IGBC is part of a World Green Building Council initiative to drive awareness of building materials and why it's important that we understand more about them. Decarbonising buildings is not only about not burning fossil fuels to heat our homes or power air conditioning, it's also about how we build them in the first place. And the Building Life campaign is here to highlight the embodied carbon in the materials we use in such huge quantities. So buildings are responsible for so much of our environmental impact. They account for half of everything we mine out of the ground, around 1/3 of our emissions, and 1/3 of everything that we throw away. When we talk about whole life carbon, we're referring to the carbon emissions caused by the production of the building materials, the embodied carbon, as well as those caused by energy use in the building. And it's embodied carbon that I'll mostly be talking about for the next 20-25 minutes or so. So carbon regulatory requirements around the world are appearing all the time. This is quite interesting from the World Bank. It looks at carbon pricing initiatives around the world. And if you play around with the timeline at the top there, you'll see the rapid growth in implementation, starting with just Finland and Poland back in 1990 and growing to what you can see here. In Europe today, the French government is probably leading in building in carbon into its procurement procedures, requiring whole life carbon analysis and the introduction of more timber into public buildings. So if you want to win infrastructure and building contracts in France, this is going to be crucial. In France, you can't make environmental claims about your building products unless you have the data in the form of an EPD to back it up. Holland requires whole life carbon assessments for planning permission. Denmark and the other Nordic countries are introducing legislation at the building level, and it's now written into the new London plan. And this is starting to proliferate as other cities follow suit. Finland, for example, is aiming for net carbon neutrality by 2035. There was a Chinese announcement at the end of last year on their net zero trajectory to 2060, and the US has rejoined the Paris Agreement. You can see it's missing from when I took this image. So you can see how getting a better understanding of carbon emissions and where they come from is only going to become more and more important. Now, this is the same data, only it shows the growth in the proportion of our emissions that are under some form of pricing regime. There's 23% today, and that's only going to go upwards. So the aim of the Building Life project, or the main aim, is to reduce embodied carbon by 40% this decade and work towards zero embodied and operational by mid-century. Currently, the EPBD, which is the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive in Europe, only looks at the energy use of our buildings, the operational energy. But a building doesn't just appear, its whole life cycle is much more. And although operational energy has traditionally been the greatest emitter in a building's life cycle, as we build better, more efficient buildings, this operational energy becomes not less important, but the other aspects of the building become just as important to address. I'll come back to this circle later on. So I modelled a very modest concrete block house here in Ireland because concrete block is still the most common way of building here in Ireland. And this is what a new, well-rated and A2 rated building might look like in Ireland today. You can see the 45% of the lifetime emissions are from operating the building, so heating and cooling, mostly heating. But 45% also comes from producing materials to build it too. I'm going to show you a few charts, but they're all based on this same data, just displaying it in different ways to show the profile of the emissions over time. So today, an electric heated home with a good energy rating, requiring about 50 kilowatt hours primary energy per square metre per year, in Ireland would come with a carbon cost of about 9 kilos of CO2 per square metre per year. And this factors in the electricity generation and transmission and all the fossil fuels still used in the grid. This will obviously vary depending on the climate of your country and the energy demand that follows on from that. In Ireland, the National Planning Framework has a target of 500,000 new homes to be built by 2040. And those should all perform to this kind of energy rating. So as the grid decarbonizes and becomes more efficient, we would expect that 45% to actually shrink. So you can see here the same data, that energy is at the top, that top 45% electricity in use. But beneath that, we have all the other emissions associated with the building over its lifetime. And it's those that I want to focus on today. There are other considerations, but this is what I want to talk about today, the materials in particular. You can see they're the second largest contributor there. So this chart shows those same emissions, but spread out over the lifetime of the building. If we assumed a 50-year lifetime, that yellow, the yellow at the bottom there is your annual electricity use. That's what you'd see on your bill. But it's this big burp at year zero that's the elephant in the room. That's made up of manufacturing materials, what we call the A1 to A3, bringing them to site, the A4, and construction itself, the A5. And the problem is these emissions happen now, and they're not spread out over years in the future with the benefit of a cleaner grid that we're all working towards. There's nothing we can do about these. Once they're in the atmosphere for good. And because they're in the atmosphere for good, this is what it actually looks like. You can see the same 50 years life cycle at the bottom. As carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere, it has a cumulative effect. So while we'd expect that dotted line to flatten in reality as the grid gets cleaner, we're setting ourselves a starting position of over 40 tons on a modest house, and we're planning on building 20,000 of these every year. So you can see why this needs addressing. So this is the problem. We're not really aware of our own impacts, of what caused that burp at the beginning. So I'm going to try to relate them to something we're all a bit more familiar with, which is driving. We all know that driving causes emissions. The average car sold in Ireland in 2019 produces 122 grams of CO2 for every kilometre it's driven. So we're going to take a look at some materials and see how they stack up compared to that. So here's our 1 kilometre in a car, 0.122 kilos of CO2e. And here's a kilo of concrete, just 1 kilo. The same as driving 840 meters in a new car, more or less. I should say throughout this, there is variance. Just as there's variance in different models of car, there'll be variance in concrete and all the other materials, depending on the energy mix used in their production and the sources of their raw materials. So everything I'm used here is an average drawn from groups of comparable EPDs studies or modeled using average background data. So here's a brick, 1 brick, the same as driving almost 4 kilometers in a new car. Now we use about 70 million bricks in Ireland every year, mostly imported. So that's the equivalent of 250 million kilometers being driven around the island every year. The mortar that holds the brick in place. So 1 kilo of mortar, the equivalent of doing 4.8 kilometers in a new car. And 1 concrete block. Remember I said the concrete block is still the most popular way of building homes in Ireland. So 1 block is the same as 46 kilometers in the car. So if you're an architect and you cycle to work, once you get there, as soon as you specify 1 block, you've probably undone all the good you did cycling into the office. And that's what we need to be aware of. These things have an effect in the same way as our behaviors have an effect. So back to our car. So this slide highlights the importance of recycled content. Just 1 kilo of structural steel beam can require more than 3 kilos of CO2 emissions in the production process. But that can be drastically reduced if you increase the recycled content. You still have emissions from the recycling process, but you don't have the emissions of mining and harvesting from iron ore. Or you can look at alternatives that also come with other benefits. Sequestration. A kilo of timber will sequester over 1 kilo of carbon dioxide. It draws the carbon out of the atmosphere and uses it for growth, leaving the oxygen element of the CO2 where it is in the atmosphere, where we want it. So back to our car. Aluminium for facades, windows, that kind of thing. It's great for weatherproofing. It can prolong the lifetime of other materials, protects them. It's light, it's infinitely recyclable, but the production method requires huge amounts of electricity, even when some of the content is recycled. It also comes with some other nasty side products too. There are great pools of useless red sludge dotted around the world as a result of our aluminium production. But they're out of sight, so they're out of mind. 107 kilometers for 1 kilo. Back to our car. And last one, insulation. So the production of wood fiber insulation has about the same carbon cost as EPS, but it also absorbs carbon as it grows before we harvest it. So this cubic meter of insulation can balance out about 860 kilometers of driving emissions, even after you've taken the emissions of its production process into account. So we need to think about storing that for as long as possible, reusing it after the building is deconstructed. Because if it's incinerated, then that sequestration is gone and we're back to square one. This, along with the rapid depletion of resources and the damage done in extracting new, is one of the reasons we need to be thinking about circularity and reuse of what we already have, storing carbon in bio-based materials and keeping those materials around for as long as possible. Now, everything I've shown has been simplified. There could be 100 other reasons for choosing or not choosing a specific product, but I just wanted to clearly show you the differences in that one property, the emissions involved in producing them, and comparing it to something that we do every day, drive around in our cars. This needs to influence decision-making as much as cost. So why else does it matter? Well, the National Development Plan in Ireland is aiming for 400,000 new homes between now and 2030. And if we build them the way we've been building them up until now, then research coming out of UCD, University College Dublin, shows that the embodied carbon of all the materials that we're going to need will completely offset the carbon savings that we're making by adding renewables to our electricity grid. There's also the RIAI climate challenge that's asking architects to hit certain targets of embodied carbon per square meter, and I'll come back to that in a minute. There are other reasons too in Europe. The EU taxonomy, technical screening criteria for investing in buildings and calling them green, stipulates the need to measure whole life carbon to prove the buildings are as green as they say they are. The Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, the one that I mentioned at the beginning, is being redrafted at the moment, and this redraft will include the requirement to measure whole life carbon, starting with larger buildings, but eventually measuring all new buildings. And these measurements will be based on levels. Now, what's levels? Levels is a framework for measuring sustainable building design. It's about getting the whole of the EU on the same page, establishing the key objectives of a sustainable built environment and measuring the indicators that support those objectives in a consistent and shared way. The intention is that these objectives and measurements will inform everything from green public procurement to regulations and certification schemes across Europe. As Cecilia mentioned, we need to be able to measure consistently and transparently for all kinds of reasons, including access to cheaper financing and meeting future regulations. And this is what Levels aims to do. So there are 6 objectives, and they're built on 16 indicators, and you can see them all here, but I'm not going to go through them all. We're going to take a closer look at indicator 1.2, which is life cycle global warming potential. From an emissions perspective, this is the most comprehensive indicator that includes elements of some of the others. If you get this one right, then you'll probably be well on your way to producing a sustainable building design, as you will have done your homework and hopefully made all the right decisions. So all of the indicators' guidance follow a common pattern. They're all organized into 3 levels. The levels provide a choice for your sustainability reporting. You can choose to only work at level 1 to get an understanding of the principles of that indicator, why it's important, what you can do about it without measuring, or continue to level 2 and level 3 to make more scientific assessments of your design's performance in that particular indicator. So the 3 levels should be implemented at different stages in a building project. Level 1, as I said, implemented at the conceptual design of the building project. You're just encouraged to do background research and do some reading on the indicator and articulate in a statement how you're going to deal with that indicator in your project. There's no requirement for numbers or calculations, because often it is just being aware of the environmental impact that can cause you to change your mind, change your approach, and reduce your impact. Level 2 assessments are implemented as a design evolves and data becomes available. The guidance provides methodologies for how to quantify your impacts in meaningful units that can be held up for comparison with other approaches, so other approaches to the same project, and with benchmarks of what good looks like. And level 3, finally, you would undertake a level 3 assessment when the building is complete. You gather the as-built and the in-use performance data of your building and see how it compares to that level 2 assessment that you did, to see how it works in practice, not just on the drawing board. So indicator 1.2, global warming potential across the life cycle, or in other words, whole life carbon. Whole life carbon is really a branch of life cycle analysis, where we set our goal, define our functional unit and our scope, and assess our inventory of impacts and produce a final report. There is an international standard for doing assessments of whole buildings, and if you only remember one thing from this presentation, then I think it should be this slide and this standard. Standard EN 15978 sets out a framework for building level LCA. Certification schemes like BREEAM and LEED base their LCA modules on this standard, and Levels is no different. The standard breaks a building down into its elements and breaks its life cycle down into its stages. And together, the elements and the stages form the scope of your analysis. We're going to take a look at the standard next and how it helps us to model all the elements of the building across all the years of the lifetime of that building. So the methodology in the standard breaks down the life cycle of a building into its stages. And within each stage, there are modules, and we're going to run through those. So in stage A, the first two modules are called A1 and A2. They're raw material extraction and transport to a processing plant or factory. You then have A3, the third module, which is the manufacturing in the plant. So any analysis that ended at this point could be called a cradle to gate analysis, the study of the impacts from the very beginning, the cradle, to being ready to leave the factory, the gate. A4 is the transport of those materials to your building site, and A5 is the construction process itself. So together, these 5 modules form the first stage, stage A, and an assessment carried out up to this point would be from cradle to practical completion or to building handover. Stage B looks at where emissions can occur during the building's useful life, the operational stage of the building's life. We have usage, maintenance regimes, repair work, and operational energy, B6. This one is worth noting as it's the 50 years of energy use I mentioned earlier. It's typically a large contributor. But if your building's electric, then in reality, this one will depend on how carbon intensive your electricity supply is in the years ahead. So you can still do something about it. We also have replacement cycles, refurbs as required from time to time. And then finally, stage C with modules C1 to C4. These consider the environmental impact of disposing of the building. And a study up to this point would cover the building's whole lifetime, and that would be a cradle to grave study. There is one more module, which is module D. Now, module D considers what use can still be got from the building's components after its life cycle is done. A building is not only a place in the common sense of the word, it's also a store of useful materials and components that can be retrieved and used again in the next building, reducing the need to manufacture more materials in the A stage of that next building. So a study including module D is a complete cradle-to-cradle assessment, and it encourages design for adaptation, ease of disassembly, and reuse. The building is not just a place in the conventional sense, it's a store of useful elements too. And this is what it looks like on the page. As assessments are usually carried out at the design stage, the challenge is getting the right data. How do we know what we're going to use? How long will the building last? What will be done at the end of its useful life? So at a concept design stage, most of this won't be known. It's more likely that only a rough idea of size and function will be known. So we need to look to generic data, assumptions and averages of what's most likely to happen. As the design evolves and we reach stage 4 with its technical details emerging, we can start to add in more specific quantity data from drawings or BIM models and identify specific materials and their corresponding environmental performance data. So A1 to 5, B1 to 5, and C1 to C4 make up the embodied carbon. A1 to 3 is the specifying and manufacturing of every material and component. This is often referred to as the upfront carbon. It's that down payment right at the beginning. emissions that have occurred before work on site have even begun. Materials have been manufactured and they're already sitting in a warehouse somewhere waiting to be used. B4 and B5 are the replacement cycles of those components that won't last for the whole lifetime of the building. As it can be difficult to know how long it's likely to be before they're replaced, the methodology specifies estimates for these replacement cycles to keep them consistent across studies. And modules B6 and B7 make up the operational carbon. But because this is so dominated by B6, the energy needed for running the building, you may sometimes find when this is up for discussion and people talk about operational carbon, they're just referring to the B6. B6 is that energy used to heat and cool and light the building, the energy covered in the building regulations. It's not plug loads like computers, TVs, and fridges. We can get data on this from an EPC or an energy model if one's been created to give us an approximate annual kilowatt hour per year of demand. And from this, we can calculate the annual emissions from the grid. In theory, and most definitely in the past, this is the single largest contributor of emissions. But as it's spread out over 50 years in the methodology, the actual figure will depend on the carbon intensity of the energy grid during that useful period. And intensity will fluctuate, but should follow a downward trend in the future, we hope. And we can estimate water usage based on the number of people in a residential building or the average per square meter in an office building. Here you can see how embodied carbon plus operational carbon equals whole life carbon. Traditionally, it's only been operational carbon that's affected by regulations and the one that designers focus on. But as we build better and more high-spec buildings with more efficient systems, we use more material to get that insulation effect and more metals in our systems, the embodied carbon grows, and today it can account for 50% or more of a building's whole life carbon. And most of that 50%, roughly 2/3 of it, occurs right at the beginning in stage A, not spread out over years in stage B. And it can't be changed later like operational. So you see why we really need to be considering, we'd have to be considering the materials in everything we build. Module D is always reported separately, as Module D records those potential benefits to another building in the future. That benefit is outside the life cycle of this building and therefore outside the scope. It's the potential to contribute to the stage A of another building sometime in the future. Now, the data for it. The most accurate data we currently have are EPDs, environmental product displays. An EPD is a product of a life cycle analysis at the material level, so what it took to bring that material into being. In its most basic form, it's a table of numbers that quantifies the environmental impacts of the production process. They should be compliant with an international standard, EN 15804, which sets out the rules of the analysis with regards to construction products. It should also be independently verified. An EPD should tell you all about the environmental impacts that were caused by the production of the thing that it refers to. Now, there are 7 categories of environmental impacts recorded in an EPD, but global warming potential is the most commonly referenced, and it's the one that we're starting to see regulation on. It can be carried out with varying degrees of accuracy, either at a high level for an industry as a whole, with a higher level of uncertainty, as different actors within that industry will have different processes and different sources. They will have slightly varying results, but you can have an EPD that covers all of them, but makes an allowance for the best and worst performers, if you like. You could have them at a medium level for a specific product that's produced in lots of different places with different energy mixes, or you can have very specific ones where it's based on the analysis of a particular product produced in a particular processing plant. That's the most detailed that you can get. Now, if you want to understand more about life cycle analysis in general terms, take a look at standard ISO 14025 for producing EPDs and ISO 14040 for the general framework of what LCA entails. So we run an EPD scheme in Ireland, epdireland.org, and that will guide you through the production of an EPD if you're a manufacturer. That data will then be published and shared, allowing specifiers to compare and find the best products for their project. EPD Ireland, ours, is one of many hubs that make up EcoPlatform. Now, EcoPlatform gathers all this information on all these products, digitizes it, and makes it available for one reason, and that is so specifiers can compare products. And as this grows in importance, if you can get your product high up that ranking, then it stands more of a chance of being selected by an environmentally conscious specifier. And we really want to see that being an area of competition rather than just cost. Now, how EPDs help is when you're designing a building, you can use them to sum up the carbon impacts for all the different materials used in your building to create your inventory. You'll find the embodied carbon for your whole building that way. So at early design stages, we tend to stick to generic data, averages for a particular material. Now, a good source of generic data is the ICE database at Bath University in England. Now, the ICE database is built entirely on groups of EPDs and averages taken from them. It's free to download. You will learn a lot from it. You won't just get the numbers, but also there's lots of links and background information that you can follow. It's a really good research tool. So it's free. Head over there and download it. I should say, when you disclose results, it's good practice to also share this background data, where it came from, to give the full story to your audience. The quality and accuracy of your background data will affect your results, so you have to give full disclosure. Now, an EPD will always declare modules A1 to 3. You can see the modules here, they're exactly the same in the standard for materials as they are in the standard for buildings. So an EPD will always give you the A1 to A3, that production stage of the life cycle. And this is usually where most of the environmental impact occurs anyway. And it's also the only stage that can be measured rather than estimated. So the latest version of the standard, EN 15804 plus A2, now requires more information on envisaged scenarios for the end of life stages and the reference service life. So this encourages producers to look at how to extend the longevity and the recyclability of their products and help us better estimate when we'll need to replace them, the B4 module here, and how it's likely to be disposed of in that C1 to C5 stage. C1 to C4, sorry. So yeah, EPD Ireland, if you're interested, we can put manufacturers in Ireland in touch with LCA practitioners who carry out those studies at the material level, and then we can get them verified and published for you, and then promote the environmental performance of your products. So back to the building level then, EN 15978, reporting of results can be difficult to track as you're reporting on the results of lots of facets of your building across those stages, and each stage has modules within it, as we've just seen. So a reporting framework like this, with the stages across the top and the building elements down the left there, really, really useful for tracking everything. You can enter results as you learn them to build up that picture of the whole building across its whole life cycle. The numbers in green cells are input by the user, and the numbers in white cells are calculations. They're the sum results of the inputs. Another advantage of tracking results in this way means you can adjust the scope of your study to align two designs, to align them together just by making sure that you only include the same elements and the same stages in both designs. Then you can compare designs up to a certain point, but ultimately you want everything in there. So the total is in the green frame box at the bottom. It shows the overall total and the carbon score divided by the floor area to give a per square meter result. Now, both of these are important, Per square meter means you can compare this building to another one, or to a regulation, or to a standard, or to a limit. But ultimately, we're looking for the total to be as low as possible. If you have really low per square meter, but you produce lots of square meters, then you're kind of defeating the object of it. So what does good look like? What should we be aiming for? Targets and benchmarks are only just beginning to appear, and these are really European targets you see here. Buildings for different climates will have different needs, obviously. The RIAI, the Royal Institute of Architects in Ireland, launched its climate challenge in October 21. And like the RIBA in the UK, it has aligned its targets with the banded benchmarks developed by the London Energy Transformation Initiative, or LETI for short. I should say LETI give away a lot of great information and advice for free. So do have a look at their website and download the one-page advice sheets and the manuals that they give away there. They're a great, completely voluntary organization with a lot of knowledge. So you can see the modules included for these targets at the top of each of these tables here. The first is upfront carbon, and the second is all embodied carbon. You can see that in the A1 to 5 on the left, and the A1 to 5, B1 to 5, C1 to 4, including sequestration on the right. The building elements to include are the ones we saw in the reporting table, so you get the full picture of the whole building. The RIAI and RIBA are targeting Band C buildings for 2025 and Band B for 2030. This means buildings that complete in those years. So those are the kind of figures that we want to see on drawing boards today. Now, as Fran said, today there hasn't been a great deal of consistent embodied carbon analysis carried out at the building level, but we think our current building practices probably fall somewhere in the bands D to F. So we need to get moving up that table. So finally, when do you do it? As early as possible before anything is locked in. The lowest carbon building is no building at all. So the first thing to do should be to look at other possibilities. Can you repurpose an existing building or renovate an old one? What existing assets are available to you, and can you make them suitable? A renovation will almost always have lower embodied carbon than a new build, as you avoid the need to produce new foundations and structures, two of the largest contributors of that upfront carbon. If you have to build, then set the direction as early as possible. The earlier the design direction is set and everyone involved is aware and on board and understands, then the greater the potential to reduce carbon. Trying to rework and change later will be more difficult, possibly less successful, and there'll be more resistance, as nobody likes to redo their work. So do this early, set the direction. And here are a couple of free tools to help. The 2050 materials tool here, it lets you quickly look at the relative impacts of different material approaches very quickly, very simple. It can help you build up your palette at the beginning of the project and communicate it with your design team and your client so they understand why you're selecting a particular material. The Carbon Designer for Ireland tool lets you quickly sketch out your building idea in numbers, so total floor area and the number of floors that you're planning on. From that, it very quickly estimates the material quantities you're going to need and the carbon impacts that follow on from those. So you can see the difference between a timber structure, a concrete structure, and a steel structure, and the contributions of things like finishes that need to be replaced over and over again in a building's life cycle. That's ours, at IGBC. So if anybody's interested in that, then I'm more than happy to give them a demo. Both these tools are free, so do have a look. And finally, here are a couple of really good websites for people who don't like staring at spreadsheets. Materials Palette, great education on materials and their various impacts. And LETI again, go there, download their guidance. It's really useful. That's all from me. I hope you found some of this useful. And yeah, give me a shout if you have any questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you for that, Stephen, and thank you again to Guan, Cecilia, and Rachel for their talks as well. So we're going to pause for about 15 minutes now for questions and answers. All the panelists have joined us again, and yes, let's get to it. There's probably hours worth of things that could be asked of all that we've heard already. We have a question here from Danny, who says it's a question for Cecilia and Rachel. Is there a framework similar to levels currently being implemented in Kenya? If not, how important would it be to Kenya's building industry to have such a framework? So just a quick recap, levels is a European framework where building specialists can measure, report, and share environmental performance in buildings. So yeah, Rachel and Cecilia, what do you think, listening to Stephen talk about levels, and how does it compare to the Kenyan context?
Hi, so we have the Architects Association of Kenya creating the Safari Index, and there's similarity in this approach of looking at climatic zones and even subclimatic zones within a country, and then figuring out not only the right design, but also the embodied energy and the type of materials that would be sort of better for that location. I think what we're seeing in this discussion from Stephen and the Irish Green Building Council is the level of effort. So it can't just be the architects working in it. We need the engineers, we need the consumers, and we need sort of this grassroots collaboration coming together on the same type of indexes, and the chemists, everybody looking at this data at the same time on the specific use case, so that then we can really get into those nitty-gritty details that Stephen is showing on the environmental product declaration forms. Rachel?
Thanks, Cecilia. And yeah, so to add on to that, we also have on the building sector, I'll also touch on the product sector. These are international standards that we are also working with, that are going to also form what we are also working on as the KGPS, as a Kenyan standard for green building, which will be under the Kenya Bureau of Standards, a Kenyan standard. So what we are benchmarking here is the IFC Edge, and also benchmarking Green Star, which overall, Stephen said, was an overall benchmark to EN 15978. And to just touch lightly on what Edge looks at, just as Cecilia has touched on what the Safari tool looks at, the Edge tool looks at the efficiency in materials, not just materials, embodied energy in materials, which I feel is a small percentage, as Stephen was saying. We don't really look at the whole carbon aspect. So when we touch on the embodied energy of the materials, then that looks at the operational, the not really operational, but on the manufacturing aspect. But it doesn't now come to look at the afterlife and the post-construction and all that. But in operational, it looks at the energy used when during the operational phase, and looks at the water efficiency, so operational energy and operational water. And now when it comes to products themselves, then we have again the international, sorry, I went on mute for a moment there. But again, we have the international standards, such as the Global Green Tag, that we've also been having most of the manufacturers in Kenya being referred to if they want to have some EPDs for their products. So in my experience, I'd say that is what we currently have. Yeah.
The a kind of common theme that was running, I think, through all the presentations was this idea of grassroots, because Cecilia just mentioned it there as well, and the idea of solutions to climate in the built environment not just being a top-down approach, but also a bottom-up approach, and it kind of shows in different ways through all the presentations. So, Cecilia, you were talking about data and harnessing data in order to inform how to evolve the built environment, and you often hear today that people today, our digital footprint is absolutely massive. We generate data about everything we do, where we go, how we feel when we tweet. And I'm curious about, in addition to data and statistics, which are collected by governments or by organizations like IGBC or the Kenya Green Building Society or yourselves, how valuable is that grassroots data that people generate just by using a city every day, and how can that, do you think, inform urban development? And again, it's such a delicate line to walk, because you want to learn about how people use cities, but you don't want to interfere with your privacy, and which is increasingly more of a hot button issue. But yeah, what are your thoughts on kind of grassroots data being generated and how that can be used? I think you're muted there, Cecilia. There you go.
Hi, there we go. So thanks. What I was saying was consent is the key. If we have, for example, we can create a special Google map and everybody consents to be tracked on that Google map. And some of that is happening in sort of informal settlements, people saying, okay, I want to be tracked in terms of my daily route, trying to find connections to public transport or how I'm walking. The same can be done in terms of just saying, pinging. There's some efforts on, we haven't discussed this yet, but sick building syndrome. So sometimes all of these things in the design that we don't think, we said, these emissions are invisible. You feel sick when you're in a particular space and you don't feel sick when you're out of the building. Long-term effects is if there's high-level toxicity, that becomes now illness. So we can start reporting, self-reporting by consent. Oh, today I don't know why every time I walk into the building I feel dizzy. That kind of data would really help. Or I get a headache and you realize, oh, it's just bad lighting. It's not, there's no emissions there. It's just the building has bad lighting. I think those kind of initiatives would really help.
Mm-hmm. I guess we move then to how those resources can be put into practice by architects and engineers. So I think, Rachel, one thing you mentioned, which is really interesting, which I know is going to be explored in the future, is the Jenga Green Library, and this if I understand correctly, this database of sustainable materials, or that architects and engineers can go to as a resource when they're in the design process. And it's interesting because we also have Guan here, who is a practicing architect in BDP, and I'm curious about how, Guan, when you listen to an idea like the Jenga, or a database like the Jenga Green Library, where you see that fitting into your work, and Rachel, how you would advise or give advice to an architect like Guan about where in the process and how he could most effectively use something like that library to enhance his own work. I don't know who wants to take that first, or who wants to start the
you go first,
back and forth.
Rachel, and then.
Okay. So I think data, as we've been saying, is very critical to this transformation or the shift to sustainability. And I think for an architect, or as I said, this tool is for ideally everyone who wants to put up a building or a built project, let's say. That doesn't have to be a building. And this ideally just stops the intensive racking of your brain when you need to get something that's sustainable and you're thinking, okay, now their talk is about sustainability, so where do I go shopping for this? So it may not be a shop per se, but it's a library that tells you you're looking at walls and slab, yeah. So what are your options within this space, and what are, so for now, maybe just to give a quick disclaimer, what we currently have in terms of data from even the manufacturers or suppliers that are giving the data to the library, what we have is embodied energy performances of this product. So you're able to see, okay, how does say the bamboo flooring compared to maybe a ceramic tile? You'll be able to see this embodied energy is lower compared to this, so I move to this. So it just brings that visibility to some of these products that you would otherwise not really know are being sold, and makes life easier as we continue to collate this data and get it in a centralized place. Because another thing we always say is everyone is doing something, but we need to also bring our efforts together and work, like just get it together in somewhere accessible to everyone. So I definitely sell it to an architect or anyone hoping to put up a building, and they will definitely see the benefits. But I want to see your perspective on this as well, Juan.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think a database of materials would be is fantastic. We thought about it on Sherwin design at early stage. I don't know if you remember, Nair, but it's a huge amount of work as well, because then those materials are not always available, or they can't be prescribed or specified in all the locations where you could be working. But definitely, I think on responding to also what Nair said, on a couple of projects we are working currently, because those databases, they don't have all the materials so far, so they are building up. There are some coming, like the one that Stephen mentioned earlier, Materials 2050 as well. What we do is just go to the manufacturers, get the data, and we compare it, which is very time consuming. So definitely a database would help to get that much quicker. And then if it's quicker, then more people would do it as well, because otherwise, not everybody is keen to spend that extra time to look at the alternatives to save 15 or 20% of embodied carbon. But it's definitely the right thing to do.
Yeah, that's actually interesting, because I think the kind of common theme I heard from both of you there was this idea of time and convenience. And I think that as building design is moving ever more digital, that it is becoming easier to integrate these kind of softwares, these kind of databases and resources into the design process. It's no longer the case that in order to figure out the best material, you have to spend days upon days going through book after manual. There's more and more digital resources, which I guess the responsibility in the designer is to step back and try to set up their workflow as efficiently as possible, even if it takes more time at the beginning, so that when they're actually in the design process, they're in a better position to take advantage of tools such as Rachel's. Would that be fair, Guan?
Yeah, and I think it was Stephen, he mentioned it earlier. It has to be early in the process as well.
Yeah.
So something that has been historically postponed, especially where you go through a long planning processes, as you know, now. If we leave that for later, then it's much more difficult, and it costs more money. I think the graph that Stephen showed earlier is a really good one, because you can see how the later you do it, the more cost. So early stage, and that's why it's important. Education that I mentioned earlier is so important, that everybody working on the design and collaboration, as Cecilia mentioned, is not just, sometimes we want, and we discussed that a few times, we go and look at a database looking for that magic material that doesn't have an embodied carbon, and it doesn't exist. So that's why it's important. We consider them at the beginning, we use as less as we can of them, and then use the most beneficial one.
Yeah. I want to get to Stephen as well, because I agree with Guan. The graph that Stephen showed of, I think you called it, was it the carbon burp of the massive amount of carbon exuded at the very, very beginning of the project versus across time, which really again hammers home the importance of paying attention to embodied carbon before a building is operational. And you set out, Stephen, a few different ways of addressing that issue. There's the idea of building less, which the line of the greenest building is the one already built. The idea of being more careful with material choice. So you had the the metaphor of the car versus the different material choices, and there's ideas around efficiency, about trying to eliminate waste from building sites and examining waste streams regardless of what material there is. And am I correct in saying that for you, the one that stands out the most is this idea of building, of using as few materials as possible, which goes to this conversation of reusing buildings, or do you think that we should be paying equal attention to the type of building, the type of materials we use, and how efficient those materials are? Where do you think the most promise is for an architect or a designer or an engineer approaching a project?
I think from a materials point of view, in the short term, by being aware of the, every kilo matters, we're still designing in the same way as we have done for a while now. But if you are aware of the impact of your concrete, for example, then how can you minimize the number of kilos of concrete in your building design and the strength you need? So how much of the cement can you take out of that concrete and still get the building that you want? Like that's you can do that now. You don't need any more tools for that. That's something you can think about. In the longer term, looking towards sequestration would involve kind of building up our bioeconomy, so our forestry and how we use it. Currently in Ireland, we export most of it and we import timber. For what little timber we do use in buildings comes from imports, which is counterintuitive. So I think in the short term, it's all about awareness per kilo and what you can do about that, particularly concrete. If your particular building environment relies heavily on concrete as ours does, how do you approach it? Because concrete in particular has a very wide span of impacts. I gave generic averages there, but very high cement content, high strength concrete is much more impactful than low strength. So just how much do you need to fulfill your project in terms of the strength? How much do you need in terms of the depth to reduce the weight? So just being aware of it and thinking about it initially is the first step, I think. I think we could use a lot less if we tried, and that's the first step.
Mm-hmm. We're going to wrap up the Q&A then very soon. I'm curious to do one more round the table, just a very short answer, if that's even possible, for each person, about, to people watching this today, if you'd one piece of advice to give them that they could implement in their career, whether that's a book to read, a website to visit, Guan, I already know your answer, Guan, or a thing they can do in their career or in their education. If you had one thing to say to people, what would it be? Maybe we'll go in order, not to put people on the spot. But Cecilia, what would your one piece of advice be to listeners and watchers?
Find sort of one material and learn about it in terms of awareness and different impacts. And you'll start seeing that as you learn about that one material, you start connecting to the others.
Rachel, what's your piece of advice?
I'd say start with the end in goal, so that you're intentional in all your processes, because building can be repetitive at times. So you'll find that once you've started with the end in mind on one project, this will be replicated in the rest. And if the goal is to ensure it's a net zero building or the road to net zero, then you'll find yourself doing that in all your projects.
Guan?
I would say common sense. I used that word at the presentation, and it sounds like a too wide, but open or loose. But if you look at all the projects that are sustainable, with perspective, you would see that it's a lot of common sense in the design, and there is nothing artificial about it. So that's why it's as simple as being, common sense. Don't try to do complicated things, and that will reduce the materials, as Stephen said, and that will make things easier and reduce the embodied carbon and operational carbon.
And finally, Stephen.
I think the first thing that came to my mind, there's a book called Donut Economics by Kate Rawnsley, I think it is, or Rawnsley, I think, which kind of explains the bigger picture of why we should be looking after materials and recycling and reusing. And it kind of looks at how we approach economics today and how we could be and should be approaching it within an ecological and human context. That really does set a good bigger picture and gives you a new way of looking at things. So
Awesome.
going to economics.
And so with that, thank you to all 4 speakers here, to Cecilia, to Rachel, to Guan, and to Stephen. What we're going to do now is take a break for 10 minutes, and then when we come back, we're going to have 2 more talks. So we'll have 35 minutes from Kelly and 35 minutes from Adam. And we'll then follow those 2 talks with the final Q&A for those 2 speakers. So thanks very much, and we'll see you back here in about 10 minutes.
Thank you.
welcome back, everybody, for part 2 of today's session. So we're going to welcome now Kelly Alvarez Duran from the University of Toronto and Adam Osinski from the environmental engineering firm Atelier 10. Just a reminder, each speaker will speak for about 30-35 minutes, and then after both Kelly and Adam are done, we'll have another 15-minute questions and answer session. So you're welcome to submit questions throughout the talk on our YouTube live chat over on the Share Your Green Design YouTube channel. And with that, I see Kelly's on the screen, so take it away, Kelly.
Great, thank you. Pleasure to be with you all. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and here we go. I can't see you, so I hope just maybe Neil, if you can just let me know you can see everything on your end. All right. I'm going to speak to a basic question, and the nature of my teaching at the University of Toronto, my work at Mass Design Group has been kind of around this question of half. How do we half our emissions this decade? You know, I think this basic understanding that we're coming around to about the disproportionate role buildings have in climate change, that 40% here of annual emissions, if you haven't seen this pie chart, are directly related to buildings. 28% of that of the operations of the building exist, the buildings that already exist, and then the 11% of the new construction that we introduce every year on Earth. That 11% as well adds to that pink piece of the pie. But I think what I'm kind of most interested in lately is certainly my education when I was trained 10, 15 years ago was not focused on the blue pie at all. And it's that understanding of the critical kind of time value of embodied carbon and the decisions we make that drive that wedge and how we're going to half both of these together and see them together. This approach is really informed by working in a place like Rwanda for the better part of the decade and working on projects like this, Rwanda Institute of Conservation Agriculture, where from the beginning we had our eye focused on this question of not just halving emissions, but how do we even have a net zero project? What are the materials that we need to use, and what are the overall approaches to, say, landscape, site, buildings, operations, energy, etc.? How do we bring that all together to create a carbon neutral campus? At this point, and it was through projects like RECA and the work that we were doing at Mass that, from early on, this is testing out materials with our engineering team to find options that question the status quo. On the left, most buildings in East Africa, steel frame, steel roof, concrete, heavy structures. On the right, RECA, based on earth, based on stone and wood, back to kind of first principles of architecture and trying to eliminate cement to steel as much as possible. And so if we could do this in a context like East Africa and Rwanda, how do we do this in the rest of the world? And, coming back to Canada, I'm a Canadian. On a project I had done earlier in my career for my own family, the summer house, at that point really focused on the operational carbon. It's a completely off-grid project. All the kind of intentions around passive systems as far as natural ventilation, southern light exposure, etc. But I hadn't once stopped to think about the embodied carbon of this project. So I wanted to come back to it to assess it, and to do so, created this model of the home and kind of detail to basically do the same sort of analysis that we did with RECA. And this wood framed house in Canada, very typical of, say, construction at this point in time, is made up of many different things, and that the footprint of the house itself was 92 tons, i.e. basically a lifetime of myself driving a car on Earth encapsulated in this one house. And 10% of that in the wood. It's a kind of a wood frame project, and I think by overall, if you look at this, all you would see is wood. But beyond that, it's the things that I hadn't thought about questioning. I hadn't thought too much, and I just did because I was trained. And this is a reinforced concrete foundation, in this case, a crawl space, and the XPS insulation that keeps it, from frost protection would be the excuse we use to use this stuff. And then the asphalt shingles, and flying into Chicago yesterday, the basic sea of asphalt shingles that North American construction is at this point. And together, these two materials, two things I had not really even thought much about, represent more than half of this project's total emissions. And so, then looking back, this was written up for Dwell a few years ago, and the author starts with describing this project as highly sustainable, and that the tightly insulated structure draws its energy. ... And I highlight these things just to say, like, this is, I think, a lot of the conversation around sustainability has focused around this idea of airtightness, of passive house, of employing more and more layers of glass and insulation. And I'm here today to argue that's not necessarily a full view of what we need to be doing. My reference at this time was the Canadian Wood Frame House Construction Guide by the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. This is basically my government telling me how to build a house, in Canada these days. And what's interesting is, like, right now, of the 77 things in your typical Canadian house, 11 of them are made out of oil, right? I think that we've come to a point now where we're using materials that have unknown provenance or problematic provenance, and we need to be thinking radically different about what it is in the house, and really, should we have 77 of anything in it? And as a representation of I'd say, my state as well, as like the construction of the housing representative of larger forces, certainly Canada, an extraction-based economy and an oil-based economy in many ways, has made its way into our housing sector. So it also results in us having, of the G20 nations, the highest per capita emissions, right? And so if we're going to tackle the climate crisis, if we're going to do it, there's a disproportionate responsibility on ourselves and our American cousins about reducing our footprint by half, because that half is far more significant than most any other country on earth. So that's the question I wanted to come to the University of Toronto and ask. How do we halve the embodied carbon of all construction in Canada this decade? And it's an important question because Canada is growing very quickly. We're an immigrant-driven population, and I'm certain we're going to see more and more population growth in Canada as the climate crisis ratchets up. I came to the U of T to basically, start this half research studio to answer that question, and it was inspired by, one thing happening in Canada is the city of Vancouver, the first embodied carbon policies in North America, and this part of their climate emergency action plan, and they had the wherewithal to say that half of what question. Well, they went out in 2018 and procured a study of recent construction to say, what are we doing right now as a benchmark to measure against? So, knowing that Toronto and Vancouver have a healthy rivalry, I came to Toronto and enlisted, the projects of friends and partners across the city that looked at multi-unit residential housing, I'd say the main type of construction happening, of different sizes and all complete or in progress in the last 5 years. And so this was intended to be kind of a catalyst for discussion in the city around what's driving what embodied carbon is and how we're going to address it. I think that the students and everybody involved, so here you can see us interviewing, one of the students interviewing the practice, was a really, I think, fun process to begin to take buildings apart and put them back together and ask questions of why'd you go with this material or this system over another, right? The students were asked to take the 2D drawings and bring them back together, familiarize them with specifications, getting them into, frankly, the weeds of a project at the stage of their education. You can see, begin to build up these things into blocks, into smaller pieces, some cases having to use Google Translate here for one of the projects in Sweden. And here then doing a very detailed, much like the one I did for my cottage, a detailed sectional representative structural bay model here, and putting that into things like one-click LCA and a bill of quantities. So really, this allows you, I think, in a way, to understand this is what buildings are. They are quantums of material, organized in specific ways. And this were the results of that first study. So here you can see that of the projects, the low-rise ones on a square meter basis at 251 on average were roughly half that of the mid and high-rise projects that are primarily made out of reinforced concrete. And so right away, it's kind of, if you need to halve the embodied emissions of construction, well, we should probably be building lower, denser stick frame houses in Canada. That would be the first thing we should be doing. But beyond that, I think that what I'll show you is it reveals there's a lot of things that are happening that are driving architecture that have unintended consequences in our emissions. Now, the first driver, and this is a global one, this is not unique to Toronto or Canada, is that cast in place reinforced concrete is the largest driver of emissions across all projects. The low-rise projects that employed wood frame, as I mentioned, roughly half that of the concrete. The lowest carbon mid-rise project employed steel and hollow core structural systems, which resulted in dramatic reductions. And so these are recommendations that I made to planners across the country about, what can you do from a planning perspective or a policy perspective to incentivize, lower design, lower carbon structural systems, reduce materials, et cetera. Here's a view of those 10 projects through that kind of lens, and you can see that concrete, is the major force. The radius of these pie charts is representative of total emissions, and then the colors per material. And right after concrete is aluminum or aluminium to most of the world. And the second driver, and this is totally in the kind of purview of architects and not structural engineers, are envelopes, so the building's envelopes. And so XPS insulation and aluminium extrusion-based glazing systems, so curtain wall, window wall, all that glass, all the mullions carrying that glass, carry the highest embodied carbon of all building materials in the study. XPS is insulation, extremely high global warming potential, and aluminum sourcing and smelting. You can just imagine, how difficult it is to make aluminum, is also extremely energy intensive, resulting in a relatively high embodied emissions compared to other metals. So my recommendation here was to incentivize the development of lower carbon envelope systems and to follow the AIA's advice to avoid foams. I'll more on that shortly. And here's a kind of overview of some of the envelopes that we saw. So on the right, window wall, curtain wall, and in the middle, more steel stud and a variety. And you can see a big delta here, both in embodied carbon, but also in thermal performance. So these, if you just think about the glass structures that are, we see worldwide, they're poorly performing, they're doing nothing operationally, and they're abhorrent from an embodied carbon perspective. The student here comparing XPS on the left with a wood fiber board, from a global warming potential, miles apart, and product on the right that we have to import currently from Bavaria that 100 years ago was the norm in Canada. And now kind of more interesting things are things like on-site parking and subgrade floor area, and that, foundations, parking structures, basements, below grade area have disproportionate impacts on a project's carbon. And this is worldwide. And this is just, to decontextualize this from Toronto a little bit, that we're building large underground basements for cars, principally because much of the world is governed through FAR or floor area coverage ratios that do not account for the below grade area is not part of that calculus. So basically, in the city of Toronto, legally you could excavate to the the core of the earth, and that's a problem. And so my recommendation here is that to reduce and limit on-site parking requirements, or just get rid of basements. Here's a view of much like my cottage and the crawl space, these residential projects here, the foundations representing upwards of 90% of the project's total emissions. So on the right, that's underground parking. But even these other ones that have that kind of half basement, 2/3 to 70% is just the foundation and the XPS. On the taller projects, a really big swing here, and you can see one project that was built on top of an underground water course, 50% of its total emissions is for a parking garage, right? And all the way to then 8% next to it, which was not allowed to go down because of flood. It's in a flood zone. So it's a real blessing from an emissions perspective. The one student said, well, Kelly, I know how to, half the emissions, just get rid of on-site parking. And she's dead right. This is exactly what we should be doing. The fourth thing is this parking also has a kind of kicker to it. So the spacing of parking produces structural grids that are often out of alignment with those of a typical residential project. So, projects that employ transfer slabs, transfer structures to mediate these alignments have higher embodied carbon as a result. And the one project I'll show you here, Alex Park, its thick transfer slab is a large contributor to the project's total footprint. So, here is a view of that parking, structure, 2 floors of underground parking. On the left, you can see the structural grid of the parking in black and that of the housing in red. And to mediate these things, the entire ground floor is a 1 meter deep, thick, reinforced concrete slab. And this, I don't know if any drawing, this is basically the definition of insanity here, that we're employing all this material to house cars below grade. And the fifth thing, and I think this is the angular plane, the Hugh Ferris effect, that zoning, step backs, requirements for angular plane, all the things that I think we did at the turn of last century to get light onto the street has resulted in far more complicated structures above. And particularly for mid-rise projects. So the kind of wedding cake kind of zoning that you'd see, this is worldwide, has undue impacts. And so there's a project here where I kind of mapped out a bit of the stepping back and the additional columns that were happening in it just because of the setback laws. I'll get into a couple projects in greater detail to show the methodology. And what we did is we took a part of a whole project. It's really difficult to do a whole building LCA in the course of a semester for one student to take on. So they took a part of the building as a representation for the whole. So you can see here one of the 7 townhouses to tell you about the whole project. These townhouses, like my cottage, these smaller projects have a lot of stuff in them, like the CMHC one previously. And the student here was interested in modeling or representing, the project, the volume and the material associated with it, and then the volume of the emissions associated to that material. So corresponding here, the ready mix concrete above and below grade, the types of wood in the project, the differences between plywood and construction lumber. Here's drywall, something we use so ubiquitously in our projects, massive driver of emissions, relatively speaking, and brick. So this project had some unique brick on it. Interviewing the architects, they wanted shades of brick that you couldn't get locally. And they went and sourced them, as far away as Nebraska and Arkansas. And that had a disproportionate impact. And the first assumption is that impact is driven by driving, like by transportation distance. But it's not really that. Like this, though important, this is not the major source of the emissions. It had more to do about where that brick is being fired. And so, if there's one thing you take away from today, it's this understanding that geography is critical to understanding both the embodied carbon of a project and the operational carbon of a project. So you can see this was taken this morning. This is a view of the electricity of North America, and very different. For every kilowatt hour, you can see here, Nebraska is roughly 12 times more emissive than Ontario, i.e. you've got a brick being fired in Nebraska, it's got 12 times more embodied carbon. As well, that building in Nebraska is using 12 times more power to heat and cool itself. So the argument, I think, for things like passive house and additional insulation is much stronger in a place like Nebraska and weaker in a place like Ontario. But I think begs bigger questions about how and where we should be investing money into, say, manufacturing, but also how we should be supporting the greening of grids in parts of the world that aren't that green. And I think these are kind of more macro questions that certainly are beyond the scale of a building. But this, back to the friend insulation here, you can see XPS, that small little block in the middle for that foundation, enormous, off the charts on the right. And this is a material we've been using, certainly not thinking too much about it for the last 3 decades, blindly not knowing that it's, ripping a hole through our ozone. The stuff we took out of our fridge in the 80s, we decided to repackage and put it on our foundation following. And specifically spray foam. The student was interested in this spray foam that's really become prominent in detailing, specifically around air tightness. And what is spray foam? I think it's a good question. We don't really stop to think too much about what that hatch between our joists actually is. And it's a two-part it's a two-part product. You have a foaming agent and you've got a blowing agent, and it's using hydrofluorocarbons. And so that blowing agent is problematic. This is the stuff that's not good. The kind of things that get into the atmosphere quickly and do a lot of damage. So he was, beginning to look at, what the differences between products that were out there. So, looking at environmental product declarations of things from manufacturers that can tell you about embodied carbon, and was perplexed that, the EPDs for the 2 North American suppliers are roughly quarter of the one for Europe, which is a kind of bizarre thing. Usually we think we're worse. And so why was that? And he went into the EPD and discovered that, in fact, that the manufacturer was claiming that, once disposed of in the landfill, it's actually acting as a carbon sink, which is specious. Like, how does that work? Why is it when you landfill spray foam, it's actually, helping us sequester carbon? So he went and looked at the paper that the EPD referenced. In fact, that's not at all what they claim. That there's a big spread of time here between 9 to 300 years that it will begin to break down and release more. So I think it's beyond not just about what we put in our buildings, not just about what you need to wear to work to apply them, but also where does that material end up, ultimately in that 9 to 300 years. And I think that this, do you want to go to work with the guy on the left? And if you don't, you should probably not be using the stuff. Another one of the projects, a townhouse to learn from in thinking about the great North American entitlement to basements, is that normally the project wouldn't have basements. It was in this case, it was a redevelopment of a site that had pre-existing social housing on it, and that the occupants, in order to be go along with the redevelopment to add density, they insisted that their new houses have basements, even though they didn't have them in their initial ones. That they were critical to the occupation. And this is a kind of view, if you're not from my part of the world, on the left, every house that's been built in the last 50 years, this is basically the kind of foundations it has. I mean, it's just incredibly wasteful when you think about it. And then thus what we tend to do with them on the right, filling them with stuff. And so I asked the student, well, sure, they really wanted that additional space. And the space is seen as a kind of cheap, free, uncoated space. Again, it's below grade. What if we just did that slab on grade? And you can see here the difference, that would shave roughly a third of the project's emissions just by getting it above grade. And then I asked a question kind of perhaps a bit more radical. What if we did stone foundations? The things that we've been working with in Rwanda and pushing stone in a seismic zone, certainly we could go back to using those in Canada. What would that do? And so here it is, 3 different foundations, one below grade, one slab on grade, and one of stone. And I'd say I'd just stop here just to think, what have we been doing for the last 120 years? What is the direction of architecture? Another project to look at here is one using hollow core. And again, a kind of technology that somehow got left behind from the 60s and 70s, seemingly, because of the speed of fly form concrete. This project, difficult soil conditions, and here, the architect first said, well, we'll never use steel and hollow core again. It was so complicated. We came back and showed the math, and in fact, like, well, actually, wow, that's amazing. We're going to do it on all our projects. These things, are really reducing materials and weight of the project. And you can see on the quote, we would probably use cast in place concrete instead of hollow core again. And then the other driver was the mechanical lift system for parking. So we knew early on the parking wasn't going to go work on the site because of the soil conditions. We had to find an alternative. And so, they challenged the city for minimum parking requirements. If you're watching this and you're working, some part of the world where there's minimum parking requirements, challenge it to 0 or at least cut it down, because that alone is a massive driver. And so even by getting it to half, what they did is intelligently package it into a stack system. So the total volume and surface area associated with parking dramatically reduced. And here's the difference between hollow core and cast in place. And so if you can just imagine, you're removing half to 2/3 of the volume of the same floor area by going to hollow core systems. And it just begs the question why we're not using more of this right now. This research I published about a year ago and basically put this open letter out, why we need standards, why we need these across every city in the world right now. And I think it needs to happen at municipal levels because embodied carbon is so incredibly regional. And this year I had a follow-up studio that said, okay, if concrete's roughly 500, there's a lot of conversation and promise around mass timber. What's mass timber? And so similarly, went around Toronto to find some of the mass timber projects, only one completed. So went a little further afield, went out west to Portland and Spokane, over to the UK where I'm based, and 2 projects in Sweden, basically to say, how is mass timber even different across geographies? What's driving it? And, part of this, the studio was exposing students to forestry itself. I think, again, the advantage of wood in many ways is that the supply chain can be fairly transparent. You can go out and you can see it for yourself. And so this is forestry alive and well in a part of Ontario, not far from Toronto. And the results from the mass timber were kind of interesting. That on average they came out to about 416, or roughly 80% of the housing. But important to also note that we're looking at housing compared to commercial and institutional. And there's less walling, there's less overall, there's basically less material density. So it's not all that different. And I think that was my first observation, is that mass timber really only offers minor reductions in embodied carbon. But if you take into account biogenic sequestration, is much different, and that's roughly 40% of typical construction. There's a live debate right now about how to best account for this in a material. Now, to look at, to kind of illustrate this, on the two projects, the one on the left and the one on the right have the exact same embodied carbon, 357, but much different sequestration per square meter. You can see on the right a building with far more wood in it. So the question is, are they the same, or are they different, and how do we account for that difference? The second thing, compared to the envelope systems of the previous year, the stark contrast that this year's were much lower because they had a better window to wall ratio. They incorporated wood into the facades themselves. They used a lot less aluminum. So here's a kind of overview of this year's envelopes, and you can see a big range, some heavily aluminum and metallic, double pane. You can see here on the left there a dual glazed system or double skin. But then the ones, toward the metal, potentially net negative because they have got so much either wood fiberboard and CLT and even cedar shingles in the TRCA project there, doing everything possible to lower embodied carbon and potentially be a net negative. A key thing, similar to the bricks I showed you, that geography with the wood is super important. So understanding where that wood is cut and dried, just like that brick, is critical. A tree is not a tree. And so some of the projects that we had here, the one from Toronto being sourced from the middle of Alberta, the one built in Washington State, coming from as far north as well as Edmonton, were some of the glulam beams, as compared to the project in Oregon that was completely sourced and manufactured in state. Thinking about the various supply chain hands this goes through, like also who's cutting the wood, who's drying it, who's putting the assembly together. There are a lot of kind of stages in it too, and so that wood's moving around between these facilities, mostly by truck, and that adds up. And so of the wood's own embodied carbon, you can see that geography really drove the difference here between these projects based on whether it was continentally or regionally or locally sourced. A fourth thing to consider is taking a whole life view. So that this is hopefully the second thing you walk away with today, is that we can't just think about a building's operations or just a body's embodied carbon. We need to see them together, and we need to see them over time. And so, the student here looked at, if you start with a lower embodied carbon and you have a higher efficiency project, your overall reductions, between now and 2050 can be significantly less. In this case, a 60% reduction compared to the standard or the average. So I think it's looking at these things together that we need to be doing to make informed decisions about the time value of both embodied and operational as trade-offs. And the last thing is being specific and not generic. So these industry-wide generic environmental product declarations can vary significantly from manufacturer-specific ones. So shopping around when you're looking at sourcing your materials, shop around early and call them and ask them what's driving their supply. I think asking manufacturers to do EPDs that don't will allow them to understand their own supply chain and shed lights on their processes and find the reductions that they need to make. So ask them for EPDs and ask them to update them regularly. This came out from the one student saying, Kelly, my project is like almost twice that was done by the Carbon Leadership Forum for the same project 2 years ago. What am I doing wrong? And I'm like, I don't think you're doing anything wrong. Go back and have a look and look at what they're basing their assumptions on. And so here you can see in 2019, the building was 207 kilograms a square meter, done by the who's who of the embodied carbon world. And in digging into it, what she found is that the vast majority of the EPDs were generics. And this is because, only a few years ago in North America, there were very few manufacturers doing this. So because of all these generics that resulted in a lower number, and now that as we have more specific manufacturer-based EPDs, you can see here a big swing between a generic assumption for mass timber and the specific ones, depending if you're gunning it between Edmonton or Penticton. That tree is not a tree. It's 4 to 5 times different. And also, where your tree's coming from, and thinking more macro about, and this is Albertan forestry, as you can see over the last 3 decades, where planting is getting far outpaced by harvesting. So is wood sustainable in Alberta? Evidently not. This research, then, the conversation where we're at right now, just to wind it up, is took this research and brought it to the City of Toronto, and have been working with them for the last year on building upon it to develop policy for future construction in the Toronto-Hamilton area. It's the first of its kind in Ontario. It builds on what we've seen in places like Vancouver and London, other parts of Europe. And taking this to the city has been incredibly rewarding, and engaging the wider industry, including the builders and the manufacturers, to say, how do we do this right, and what would the implications be? And I think the feedback has been supportive, and in fact been, be more blue sky, not less. Let's really go for this. Part of that, they asked us to look at one of the city's own projects that's currently in development, to say, like, how would this policy affect, design our own procurement? So we looked at this. It's a emergency service facility. Basically, it's a garage for their ambulance fleet. And so we pulled it apart, and we did a kind of whole life carbon analysis of it here, including a photovoltaic and the site, thinking of the site as actually, the landscape can be the positive part of a project. Again, there's my good friend XPS being a large part of the driver. So looking at where emissions were as a place to start, and working with, just looking at even late stage, doing specification adjustments, looking at the concrete spec, looking at the sealant. We managed to shave off another 800 tons of emissions of this project, which is significant for 2 weeks of work. The 800 tons, is years, as you'll see here in a second, of emissions. And also looking at the difference between having the project be on the grid or off the grid. So the embodied carbon of photovoltaics themselves are significant, but they pay themselves off pretty quickly relative to the grid. Now, that's a question of, like, how do we half that of Canadians again, and you replace that flag with any nation in the world. And this is kind of to wrap how to do this in my mind is, we have to take these into account. We can't just do business as usual. We have to figure out how to get radical. We need to think about the use of our projects in different ways and get them fully passive and off grid as much as possible. Designing for the end of that service life so that that reuse, that building can become another building, that material can easily be employed in a new building and not sent to some landfill. And then importantly, finding out on your project where are the opportunities for insetting. I think we need to be doing far more use of our cities and the spaces around them for the insetting, and not thinking about offsetting as this thing that happens halfway around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Kelly. It was a highly interesting talk. And we're going to go now to Adam Mazinski from the engineering firm Atelier 10. Just a reminder, after Adam's talk, there'll be another 15-minute Q&A session to round up today's session. So please stay tuned for that, and feel free to submit your questions via our YouTube chat on the Share Your Green Design YouTube channel. Other than that, Adam, all yours.
Thank you, and thanks, Kelly. That was excellent. I don't think I have to do anything now. It's also a great pleasure to be with everyone. It's been really interesting. I'm going to go backwards a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about history, like how we've gotten to where we are, and why we're talking about embodied carbon. Then I'm going to offer up just some recent lessons learned and ideas on some projects from the UK and London specifically. And I should probably say from the outset that, these are just recent lessons that we've learned in our practice. They definitely are not the be all and end all, but hopefully they offer some ideas and offer some provocations about things to think about. And there might be one or two things. In fact, I can think of one, certainly, that's at odds with some of the things you might have heard previously. And then we'll go very quickly through a few myths and just touch on what is emerging in practice at the moment in the UK. So I always like to go, as I said earlier, like to go backwards, and I think it's really important, this idea that a lot of the topics that we're talking about now aren't new. They've been around for 50 plus years, certainly before Bucky Fuller himself. But there's a fantastic book by Mr. Fuller. If you haven't, well, there's a fantastic book whether you've read it or not. If you haven't read it, you should read it, which is Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. And just starting to sketch out the idea that, you know, we need a plan for what we're doing over here. And that shortly thereafter was Limits to Growth, the Club of Rome report that for the first time, you know, in quite dramatic fashion, sketched out this idea that there is a limit to what we can do and that we're not that far away from it. And at the time they were saying, you know, within the next 100 years. At about the same time, there's also the 1970s and 80s-ish oil crisis. And I bring this up for a couple of reasons. Number one, because I think it shows how punitive cost and punitive price can be a driver for action and for conservation. So if you, in the, you know, late 70s, early 80s, oil was around about the same cost as it is today. And it sparked a period of conservation and mass insulation efforts. And the other reason I bring it up is because it's, you know, scarily close to where we are at the moment in terms of an oil price. This lovely cartoon from the RIBA journal, also in the mid-70s, which I love this as a concept, right? Which is sketching out, you know, why is environmental design important against this idea of our never being able to be right. And I think this is such a fantastic lens, which is we don't need to be right. We've just got to understand how wrong we can afford to be. And I use that as a lens in a lot of the work we do, which is we don't have to be right. We just need to know how far wrong we can go. This is really timely. This was declassified very recently. This was a memo from Frank Press, who worked in the Carter administration in the US, also late 70s, where he was writing about, you know, catastrophic climate change and the possibility of catastrophe. And again, this is, you know, nearly 50 years ago, and I think this was declassified very, very recently. You might have seen it in The Guardian yesterday. There are also success stories. The hole in the ozone layer is probably the greatest global success story in terms of action and reaction. You know, and I think growing up, so I grew up in South Africa, not too far from where the hole was, and I remember as a child, you know, every time we went outside, we were told about the hole in the ozone layer. Make sure you're wearing sunscreen, and we galvanized as, you know, as a global society, and we've actually reversed the, you know, the deleterious consequences of the HFCs and CFCs that were partially causing it. So I think we should hold up the action and response on the hole in the ozone layer as a beacon. And then more recently, there's been a lot. There's been brilliant activism through, you know, David Attenborough. There's been the plastic mission, Greta inspiring, you know, a worldwide movement, and cities have started to act. You know, San Francisco certainly, and New York, and London is definitely at the forefront of the climate challenge. But change is visible and it's not pretty out there. George Monbiot puts it really well, which is everywhere you look, there are signs that the system is creaking. And he calls this Mayday, and I think it's quite right. And you'd expect us as a society to respond with a little bit more urgency than we have shown. Because our response is to do things like this, right? Which you can question, you know, its value. Our response is to show graphs like this. But I also want to be really clear that you cannot build your way to net zero. So building stuff is not a solution to the climate crisis. So we can do lots of things better. And I think a lot of what we're speaking about at the moment is about doing things better, but we aren't necessarily solving the climate crisis. And I think we should be cognizant of that, and we should acknowledge that. Paul Hawken of Project Drawdown fame, he puts it really well, which is, he talks about this idea between mitigation and reversal. So if you imagine if you imagine driving in a car, if you're going to have a car crash and you mitigate that, well, you still have a car crash. You maybe just crash a little bit slower. If you reverse the car and turn around, perhaps you avoid the car crash. And I like to think of the work we do in climate change the same way. Mitigation is not good enough. I will also say that we are focused heavily on carbon. We talk about carbon tunnel vision a lot, which is this, you know, this focus and this laser-like obsession with carbon. But we shouldn't lose sight of the myriad other aspects to, a healthy set of Earth systems. Things from inequality, things like limited, resource scarcity, and all of these things actually, and there are, thousands more than are sketched up over here. All of these things actually should be balanced somehow together. And I mean, fully aware, we don't have the language, we don't have the tools to do that at the moment. But it's worth bringing in, even if we can focus on one or two of these as a tension with the work we do in whole life carbon study. So I'm not going to spend too much time on why carbon, because I think Stephen and Kelly have done a lot of that already. But just to summarize, we talk about the upfront carbon, so the stages A. We've got in use and end of life, so the B's and C stages, and then the future life, which doesn't necessarily come into the accounting so easily, but like many of the things on this slide, really should be considered as as underpinning anything we do, and that's looking for where we can reuse things, recycle them, repurpose, any other RE prefix word we can think of. When we talk about this net zero future, and I promise this will be the last time I use that word, we really need this two-pronged approach, right? So we have to at once improve our energy supplies, so get more renewables and more cleaner energy onto our grids. And at the same time, we have to reduce energy demand, right? So that's improve building stock, retrofitting instead of building new, as an example, adding insulation to existing buildings, so that at some point the energy demand and the energy supply can meet in the middle, and that's what we that's a happy place to avoid a word I'm trying not to say. But these things are coupled. We're not going to get there without doing both of them. And so when people offer up this idea that, well, in the future, all energy will be clean, why can't we just do whatever we like? That future doesn't happen without that reduction of demand. We've spoken a bit about, the two types of carbon in buildings. We have the embodied carbon, so from the materials themselves that are used to build the building, and the operational carbon, which is the building itself in use. And if you imagine these emissions over time, then you'll see your embodied carbon, you definitely have this real big peak right up front, at say practical completion, you're handing over the building. And then there are these little blips as you go along the building life cycle. And maybe you have a slightly bigger peak in 30 years when you do a little renovation. Operational is a bit different, which is operational just is entirely cumulative. So building and building and building and building. And as Kelly alluded to earlier, when I was being trained, we always focused on operational. Everything was about energy efficiency, air tightness, thermal insulation, COPs, etc., etc. That was the be all and end all. And in the last number of years, embodied, all the interplay between the two has become much better understood and much more a part of the common lexicon. The other thing to say about operational is there are always, well, as there are with embodied, but more so perhaps with operational, there are always these multiple possible trajectories depending on how the building is used, what happens to the electrical grid that is supplying it, all those sorts of things. And the further we go out in time, the less fidelity over that sort of thing we have. And if you imagine putting both the embodied and operational emissions on the same graph and stretching out in time, you might see in the UK a typical building at the moment is 60% embodied carbon up front, but a really efficient building, the sorts of buildings that we're designing now, are mostly embodied carbon, certainly initially, and that the operational carbon may never exceed the cumulative embodied carbon. In terms of guidance, it's one of those things where there was nothing and suddenly there was everything, and that makes the playing field quite challenging. So to the far left of the page over here, there are some of the European standards that started to put in place the frameworks for how to measure and report embodied carbon. In the UK, certainly there was a really good guide that came out, piece of guidance that came out at the end of 2017, which is the RICS guidance, and that has been very much the bedrock for a number of other documents that have come subsequently. Some of them have come more than once subsequently, and you can see how increasingly crowded the space has become. And so that led to the need for a little bit of alignment, as often the case. So I like to say that carbon targets are like washing machines, and at the moment people are trying really hard to stick stickers on them like this. So we do in the UK now have, from some of the industry bodies, an aligned set of targets. So for this is the grading for offices. They are, current best practice is seen to be a C, and as Stephen said earlier, most buildings are probably DEF at the moment. And the stretch targets are, well, anything lower than that, so Bs and then through the As. And there's a similar version for whole life, which I'm going to skip over. Our clients are insistent that we land up in the stretch target range, and it's really difficult, particularly in London. I thought I'd offer some ideas, over of things we've learned over the last few years. There is somewhat of an order to this, and I think the first idea is that design matters. So we talk a lot of time about specification. We hear a lot about using recycled content, aluminium, or using cement replacement in concrete. But actually, it's about the bones, and the bones is in the design. And I think before we're talking at all about specification, we should be getting the design right. Are we designing, from first principles? Are we designing from principles that are sound, etc., etc.? And all of that is about driving down material use. I propose that we should also be reporting massive material over area as alongside carbon itself, because I think you can have a really fat building, so a really heavy building, lots of material that is really well spec'd, and that looks really good in carbon terms. But it's unlikely that you have a really lean building that, no matter how it's spec'd, looks really poor. And so I propose that we should, alongside all the work we're doing, report mass, material intensity as a metric too. The other reason design is really important, and getting it up front, is that it safeguards the carbon performance of your building. So if your building is designed from principles that are sound and solid in carbon terms, then your specification becomes secondary. Whereas the opposite is true. If your principles are poor, then your specification is your only ticket to good carbon performance. As Kelly mentioned earlier, height matters. There's some basic physics to this. What you see, fundamentally, and anyone who's designed a high rise will know this, is that from about 10, 12 stories above, from 10, 12 stories, your lateral loads begin to govern. And so what that means is that not only are you trying to hold the building up, but you're trying to prevent it from blowing over in the wind. And the way we prevent it from blowing over is we just add material. We add concrete, we add steel. And so height is really important. If we want to design low carbon buildings, we've got to design low rise buildings. We call this the premium for height. And there's a knock-on effect as well, which is the higher we go, the more the cores matter. So anyone who's done commercial buildings will know that the concept of net to gross efficiency. So how much useful floor area are you getting out of the total floor area? And the higher you go, the bigger your cores become, because we've got to move more people. So we have more lifts, we've got to move more servicing equipment, pipes and ducts and whatnot. And so ultimately your useful floor area, your efficiency falls the higher you go. I think it also raises another interesting point, which is certainly in the UK, all the carbon targets are based on gross floor area, not net floor area. And I think there's a case to be said for using net instead, which is the actual useful part of the building project. I might spend a little bit of time on this one, which is the idea of grids and structural systems. So I think there's a number of points here that go together, but fundamentally, down to a particular point, grid size is extremely important. So there's a propensity in London, particularly, to have really big grids. 12 meters by 9 meters are not uncommon. Now, what you can see if you ignore the systems entirely is just, well, as the grid size decreases, as the columns get closer together, the carbon intensity decreases, no matter what system you're using. And I think the systems come on top of that as a layer. So first get the grids right, then get the systems right. The other thing to say to this is that different systems are suited to different sizes. I don't think there's necessarily a case for, one size fits all. timber has, timber works in places, equally steel works in different places. So it's about using the right materials in the right place. But the key industry move at the moment in the UK is getting people accepting of smaller grids. And really, columns aren't our enemy. The reason they work better from a carbon perspective is they're just more materially efficient, which is you have less material in between the columns, working less. We've done a number of studies, through a number of our projects, looking at various sorts of systems, and we often come up against, leasing as an issue, or area, so NIA as an issue, cost and program, oftentimes an issue with timber in London. But these sorts of studies are really good to map out. And just to give an idea of the quantum, so this is a project I'm working on at the moment in London, and we've adopted a 12:9 grid, but before we did so, we had a look at what would happen if we had a 9:6. And just on the structural decks, we had a 20% saving in embodied carbon. All it was a few more columns, slightly irregular floor shapes, so it looks like lots of columns, but it really isn't that dense. And I think, especially if people see 9:6 in 3 space, in real space, you can fit anything you need to do in an office space in a 9:6 grid. So structural grid is really important. This one is one that used to be a big deal when we were all being trained, and somehow seems to have slipped off the radar. But this idea of form factor or heat loss area being a real big driver for embodied carbon, and certainly when it comes to facades, it is. So as a didactic, what we did over here was we just took the same unitized curtain wall facade and mapped it across some fictitious buildings that had form factors ranging from about 30% to 50%. And you can see that there's more than 50% increase in embodied carbon. So that's exactly the same facade with the same materials, same design, same spec. You just have less material because you have less facade to wrap. So really something that we're pushing, and it works for cost, it works for heat loss. So this is one, good form factor. It's part of the good bones, good principles, and it's win-win-win. This also follows a lot of the stuff Kelly was saying, which is this idea of level of detail. So this is from a slightly different approach, but the message is identical, which is carbon at the moment, well, certainly carbon accounting, the more you scratch, the more you find. And what we've seen is that there are a number of projects, in the UK that have these really ambitious and really impressive carbon numbers early on. And as they add detail, they go through concept, they go to detail design and get towards construction, that carbon number just increases and increases because they're finding things. We're calling this the detail gap. And so what we're trying to do in our practice is, understand what that gap is and make sure that right up front, we have that built in so that we can spend our energy and our time optimizing and driving that number down rather than understanding why it keeps going up. So really important not to forget the detail. I did want to quickly touch on what good looks like in the UK. I was a little bit trepidatious having seen some of the numbers earlier, but I think that is to the point, right? Which is none of this is apples for apples. But certainly there's a number of relatively recent buildings around London that have some pretty impressive carbon numbers. So these are upfront embodied carbon covering the full scope that Stephen was talking about earlier. And you can see 300s to just under 600. But all of these tell their own story, right? So Triton Square has significant areas of retention. So does Liverpool Street. And 22BG, which is a glass tower in the city, has 100% retained foundation. If you Google that, you'll understand a bit more. I wanted to touch as well on some hotspots, things, what Kelly was calling the drivers, things that we're really focusing on in embodied carbon. So if you take a typical, contemporary London building, you might break it down somewhat like this on the right. And this is breaking it down into, what the industry bodies deem as best practice at the moment. So about 600 kilos per square meter upfront. And you can see very clearly that there really are 3 key areas, right? So there's structures, so substructure and superstructure. There's facades for sure, the envelope, and then there's building services, MEP. I wanted to go through those three very briefly and just offer up some ideas. So structures we've spoken about quite a lot, and really the first principle on structures is appropriate grid sizing. And so we're using this phrase "love columns." There is a method of construction in London that is, to use a word abhorrent, which is this composite deck, which combines all the worst materials, but is chosen because it's really quick and really cost effective. So you have often, you have a steel frame, so really carbon intensive, and then you have the crinkly tin folded steel, the trapezoidal deck, and then you fill that with concrete. And what we've found on our project is that the crinkly tin, the composite deck, is extremely carbon intensive. And so we're hoping to say farewell, and we're hoping to make all the old stuff new again, which is ribs, waffles, and bubbles. And these are all pretty, well established concrete structural systems that have gone out of favor because they're difficult to coordinate, they take long on site, etc., etc. But they're all really efficient from a structural perspective. So we're starting on our practice to see more people interested in ribs. So doing a little bit of design work to take the carbon saving. We're seeing more and more waffles being asked about, so ribs in two directions, and equally bubbles. So a waffle with both ends of the sandwich closed. And all of these concrete systems work because they have less material in them than just a flat slab system. So we're doing lots of framing comparisons on many of our projects, looking across the board at different systems, from flat systems to, as I said earlier, the ribbed and bubble slab systems. And also trying to identify some of the other drivers. So carbon is one bit, but of course there are program implications, there are cost implications, there are coordination implications on all of them. Facades, as I said earlier, are also a hotspot, and I've just pulled out from a project that I'm working on at the moment, the donut, as it were, the relative impact of some of the key materials. This is a steel frame building with a composite deck, so it's actually really heavily weighted in structure. But you can see even in the facade, something like 15-ish% of the upfront embodied carbon is just the facade. And I think facades are complicated because they're layered. So much less so than perhaps any of the other hotspots. And so we've seen that really there are some obvious hotspots within the layer, but certainly there's some that a few years ago we weren't that aware of. So things like the internal material skin was not something we'd ever considered. Well, not something we'd considered a lot previously, and suddenly we're seeing, well, there's so much of it, and it's often an aluminium sheet, that it's costing a huge amount of embodied carbon. Similarly, external shading. Oftentimes it's aluminium, needs strengthening, and that's costing embodied carbon. Whereas you could achieve the same sort of performance by just reducing the glazing ratio, for example. So facades are complicated. This is a material pyramid, so a little bit like the food pyramid that I think many of us grew up on. The idea is that there's some good, as it were, materials near the bottom and some bad, understanding the false binary, materials at the top. And it's quite a good and representative way of just seeing where things land. But really the point with this is that within the commercial architecture in the UK, facades use a lot of aluminium, and no matter where this would be mapped for, aluminium would sit right at the top. And so we often ask, does it have to be a curtain wall? And like I said earlier, curtain walls are used for a number of reasons. Carbon is, but one bit of the kaleidoscope of decision making, but it's worth asking the question nonetheless. And what you'll see when you look at different types of facade systems is that curtain walls, because they have so much framing and so much aluminium in them, oftentimes have the worst embodied carbon. So there's, can we go back to some more traditional methods of construction? Do we need to take a little bit more time in how we build things? Are there any natural materials that we could use? I think these are all the sorts of questions we need to be asking ourselves as we try to drive carbon out of our facade systems. The answer is not just specifying high recycled content aluminium, and I think you'll see why in a sec when I get there. MEP is a minefield when it comes to embodied carbon. I think the key message, or there's probably two key messages on MEP, which is everything adds up. Just it's lots of little numbers becoming a big number. But even so, within that, what we've seen is that, distribution, so cables, ducts, pipes, etc. Those are the real ones to hit. And so what we're starting to try do on a number of projects, but it takes a special client, is to see, well, what can we get rid of entirely? So if we can't specify it better, which we can't for a lot of these things, and we don't want to, then what can we omit? So can we get rid of ventilation systems with more natural ventilation? Can we encourage users to be more tolerant of fluctuating thermal comfort conditions because the system because the building doesn't have a mechanical ventilation system? I think what we also have to do is just be careful with some of this, which is not to land up in the worst of both carbon positions, which is to design in a lot of these things like openable windows or openable vents, and then also have a mechanical system that runs all the time. That seems to be the worst of both worlds from a carbon sense. So things to be aware of. Did want to talk a little bit about myth busting. So I mentioned earlier that specifying high recycled content aluminium is certainly not an answer, and I think this comes back to this idea of global problem versus local problem. So climate change, as I'm sure everyone on this call knows, is really a global issue. It doesn't matter whether we in the UK are solve it, as it were, whatever that means. Well, it does actually. If we solve it, then everyone wins. But equally, it doesn't matter whether we do really well. We have to move the dial for the planet. And one of the cases this comes through is with some of those embodied carbon targets and specifications we were talking about earlier. So at the moment, globally, the demand for steel and aluminium so greatly exceeds the supply of scrap that no matter where the scrap exists, it will be used. It will be turned into secondary steel or aluminium. So the idea that on my project, specifying high recycled content aluminium actually makes a difference to the global issue of climate change is fallacious. If I don't specify it, somebody else will. It will get used. And we need to somehow engage our clients and really have those conversations around this is one of the reasons why specifications isn't the route out. Following from that, there's also this idea that not all scrap is actually equal. So we talk about fundamentally two types of scrap materials that are generated. You have what we call pre-consumer scrap, so scrap that maybe falls off a production line, offcuts, that sort of thing. And then we have what we call post-consumer scrap, so scrap that has been a product, it's been in the wild, maybe it was a window in someone's house, and is then recovered and recycled into something else. Now, from a carbon perspective, you can very easily make the argument that pre-consumer scrap is actually more injurious than just virgin material, and that only post-consumer scrap should be considered as being good for your carbon, and that to some extent the position that we see at the moment. So one of the things to watch out for when you're in the recycled content conversation with suppliers or with clients is understanding how much of that is pre-consumer and how much of that is post-consumer. I'll add that the thing with pre-consumer scrap is it also does lead, if it's counted as decarbonized, it leads to this really perverse scenario where the more inefficient a production line is, the lower carbon product is coming out of it, which of course is nonsense. So do ask when you're engaging suppliers, do ask for the splits, and most of them will be able to give it to you. This follows from the recycled content conversation. So again, I think this one's been around a while, which is this idea of using certain byproducts like GGBS, for example, as a cement replacement in concrete mixes. Again, in the UK, we are at the moment GGBS negative, so we depend on imports for GGBS. And the gist of it is that, like the scrap for recycled metals, the GGBS or the PFA or whatever these byproducts are, they will be used somewhere. So all we're doing is moving the displacement, but we're not actually displacing anything. And then I'm glad Kelly mentioned this earlier, but there's so much conversation about timber being this magic material. It really isn't. There's no timber bullet. You know, building a building entirely out of timber does not save the planet. It's a material just like any other. It has some fantastic and unique properties around sequestration, but ultimately that carbon will get back, well, in all likelihood, will get back into the atmosphere too. So as a delayer of carbon, fantastic. But there are so, as Kelly alluded to, there are so many questions to ask. Where was it grown? How's the plantation managed? Is it actually sustainable, that plantation? What are the processes that have to happen to turn it into an engineering product? So again, just a caution on timber as the savior. Very briefly on innovation. So these are some of the things that we're seeing in our practice quite a lot on, well, some of them are quite a lot on projects. So CLT infills, or precast concrete infills. So trying to displace material where the material is not working so hard. So we've got a number of projects where we're looking at doing things like that. So reinforced concrete frame, and then in the middle of the bay, as you can see in the little diagram over here, adding a CLT infill perhaps, or even a precast concrete biscuit. And if we did it in a precast concrete, then we maybe have an opportunity to do something novel and use, cement-free concretes. So there's a number of products out at the moment that don't use cement at all. There's also some quote-unquote modern form-finding methods and also modern form-making methods. So thinking again about using materials in a much more efficient way. And so there's some brilliant research being done on this, and also how we make them. Can we print 3D print beams? This was an article just the other day, and just make sure that we have the material where we need it, rather than this homogeneous material, this homogeneous beam, just because it's easy to make. Down in Sydney, we've seen the combination of materials, so using timber and steel in combination. So they have, this is Atlassian in Sydney, where they've proposed these I think they're 4-story steel mega floors. Then within each of these mega floors, they've got timber mini buildings. So getting away from some of the fire issues they had over there, and combining the properties of timber and steel, and reducing waste. I mean, we live in a digital age. We're so good at virtual reality and augmented reality, and yet as a buildings practice, we're so far behind. I mean, in London, it's absolutely common practice for a landlord to essentially fit out a space as a show space for the tenants, who then moves in and chucks all away. They tear out the floors, they tear down the partitions. So thinking about ways that we can use current technologies and those that will follow to reduce that waste, and in so doing reduce the embodied carbon. And then 2 final thoughts. One is a complete paradigm shift, right? Which is, rather than starting with a proverbial blank piece of paper and drawing what we want, and then going and finding the materials that suit that, starting to think about, well, can we actually reverse that? Can we start to design with the materials that are around us? And maybe that means, finding beams from a steel salvage yard, and finding cladding panels from a building that is about to be refurbished. And so that's some stuff that Atelier One and the AA at Hook Park have been doing, where they've been digitally mapping some of the trees around there, and then using those to create these absolutely stunning structures. And it's just brilliant as a concept. It's brilliant as a photograph. And I genuinely do think it's the way forward with the technologies we have, which is designing with what's around us, as opposed to finding what we need to suit what we've designed. Finally, I promise, we've tried to distill a number of these lessons into, something short and sharp. And I think through Stephen and certainly through Kelly, I think we've touched on many of these. So, loving columns, getting those grid sizes right. Building light, I love that photograph. It's a photograph of a typical office loading allowance in the UK or in Europe. It's just, that never happens. That's a bad party by anyone's imagination, But so building light, can we challenge the briefs that we're given? Reuse, of course, has to be front and center. Building clever, what can we get rid of? can we do a little bit of design? Can we get away from rules of thumb? The one that interestingly comes up in a high-rise sense is, tune mass dampers to avoid some of the lateral stability problems. Much more common elsewhere. In London, there's only one building that uses that. Building efficiently, maximizing DFMA, offsite prefabrication, standardization, innovation we've spoken about. And then finally, and the circles will probably be very small, is specifying low carbon. But I think, as I said earlier, I think that one is the one that comes right at the end after all the others have been thoroughly interrogated. And of course, I think we all know this. It's got to be retrofit first. That if we're serious about moving the dial on climate change, then it's not building, it's retrofitting.
Wow, thanks a million, Adam, and also to Kelly. I know we have a 15-minute questions and answers now. There's enough points were made, enough fascinating points to probably fill hours worth of questions and answers. To start off, though, we have a question in chat from Dane, which is a question for Kelly, but I am also curious to hear Adam's view on this. Since parking in high-density cities is always lacking, what solutions or best practices exist currently as alternatives to the underground parking basements in these cities? That goes back to the point that Kelly made about the damage of subterranean building, the amount of carbon which is sunk into below ground building. So yeah, Kelly, what are your thoughts on alternatives then to below basement or to basement to parking?
Very straightforward. Put it above grade. In cities that have got high water tables, like Miami comes to mind, you build a parking in the kind of podium or the plinth up at level 2, 3, 4, or what have you. It's, instead of putting it down, put it above. That has dramatic reductions because your structure is about the same, but you don't have the retention wall, you don't do the excavation, and there's also a hidden kicker on this, which I didn't speak to, is shoring. Any big hole has to be all the shotcrete and the horizontal piling to even keep the hole before you can even cast the structure in it. And did the numbers on that same parking lot that I showed you, that 1 meter transfer, and that was a 10% uptick on the building structure, just the shotcrete. So put it above grade. Pros of that, in this near future where we don't have single occupancy vehicles anymore, you convert it to usable floor area. It's daylit space, it's built, as opposed to think about all the basement space that the best it might become is like a grow op in the future. It's if it's not flooded. Fundamentally, we have to stop digging big holes, period. And whether it's a car or any other reason, basements are dead ends. It's bad behavior. And even on top of that, I think, Adam and I both live in London. Digging anything underground, it comes with enormous costs. Like just thinking about the Queen Elizabeth line and the embodied carbon of that versus, certainly it's much harder to do these things at grade. But it's all the subsurface works that we're doing, any of it, we have to really do at bare minimums.
Adam, do you?
I think, Kelly, you're totally right. Stop digging. It's that simple in that sense. I will just say that it does raise a lovely tension. So I grew up in a city where most of the parking is above grade, but it's all at grade plus 5 or 6, and it just knocks out a really, really important part of the city, because it all becomes car parking. And so you've got no real interaction or no real interface with those buildings, because the first lively level of those buildings is level 6 or level 7. So it's one of those things, again, from a carbon perspective, I think it's quite clear, but it's not, I mean, of course, the real answer is public transport, right? We shouldn't need parking. And that's even in London, where most new projects do not have on-site parking apart from accessibility parking. We still land up digging big holes because we want to put bicycles there. So.
And on that, I guess it's another way of thinking about parking, like why parking isn't a public provision and needs to be done on a building site, right? Like Why don't we just have a dedicated park, like above ground parking structure to service a part of the city that could meet a block's needs, as opposed to every single structure having to do their own facility. It'd be a much better use. And I keep thinking about the Herzog and Miron parking structure in Miami that everybody loves. It's a parking lot, and it's there. It can be more than just this stuff. I mean, that actually adds life to the building or to the city as well.
We have a question then from Julian, which is actually a good question because it speaks to a point that I wanted to raise as well. So Julian says, I love green building, but then it seems sometimes I don't really understand what it really is. Is it buildings that don't emit pollutants, or those that have mechanisms to save climate, or is it something else? And firstly, I'll let you both speak to that. It goes to a broader question about messaging and messaging among media, messaging towards politics, etc., that I want to get to as well, because it came up in both of your talks. But yeah, what are your thoughts on the confusion that there sometimes is about what is a green building? What should it do? Does maybe Adam want to take that first?
Sure. So I mean, this is a minefield, right? Of course. And I think the first step in all of this is a bit of honesty, right? And that's sort of where I was going at the beginning of my spiel, which was none of this is actually going to save the planet. And I think if we can help people understand that as a starting point, I know it sounds quite dystopian and maybe isn't the message people want to hear, but it's probably the reality. And then I think it's about doing things in a way that's as uninjurious as possible, right? And there are certain things that we know are particularly poor, whether it is around pollutants, whether it is around resource extraction, and then there are some things that we know that are better. And like I said earlier, carbon is but one of a myriad other coordinates that we need to be focusing on. And I think that is also quite a good way to look at things, which is perhaps one building focuses on a set of issues, but it doesn't cover everything, and another building can focus on others. It doesn't make the one building better or worse necessarily than the other.
Kelly, what do you think?
Well, I think the honesty part of this is critical. I think that I just commented the other day about the Green Building Council's term, zero carbon building, and it's like an aluminum 50-foot tall curtain wall, and triple pane, and that's somehow zero carbon. I was like, this is ridiculous. We can't. It's not. We need to be very honest about it. I think that the first admission is that, I'm an architect and I'm involved in climate change, like if this was an AA meeting version of this, and buildings cannot be net zero. They're inherently emitting. They emit when you build them. They emit while you operate them, right? There's no such thing as like a climate positive building. That's an oxymoron. What you can do is reduce it as much as possible, and that's what we're both talking about today. Mitigate it if you're doing new buildings. And to Adam's last slide, I mean, I certainly am most excited about the future of our work being focused on buildings that already exist. The greenest building is the one that already exists, right? And taking stock of that in how we maintain and improve what we've already got, and doing it in ways that don't further push us further into closer to 3 degrees, and I think things like Insulate Britain are very exciting if done holistically and using the right insulations, because they could go terribly wrong and use the wrong insulations, as I've shown, right? If people understand even the basic material choices that you've got to make your building green, because green building in Canada, as you can see, for the last 3 decades has been using a lot of oil. It's not green. And so I can totally empathize the confusion of Julian here. Really pay attention to if anything out of the talk between both of us is how to limit your material usage and pay a lot of attention to the materials that you are using.
Mm-hmm. There's a somewhat related question actually then from Ken from chat, who asks, must all certified buildings be said to be green buildings? And I could be interpreting this wrong, but I think what they mean is, if a building is certified as green, can we actually call that a green building? I might be picking that up wrong, but it actually reminds me of a point which was made in, I believe it was Kelly's talk about passive house, that if a building is a passive house certified building, can we consider that a green building? Because I think, Kelly, you made the point, passive house itself, while it does a lot to look at operational carbon, it has been accused of overlooking or not giving enough credence to embodied carbon. But yeah, to that question, and maybe Kelly first, must all certified buildings be said to be green buildings?
Well, it's a minefield, to borrow Adam's term. I mean, no, I think I can point to a few buildings that we can all, unfortunate lightning rods to the issue here. And it just speaks again, because I think we've had a very myopic focus on reducing our utility bills and at all costs, and I think it's time to reckon with that and undo decades of that thinking, and the architectural and structural pedagogies that have underpinned it. So, and that goes way back. I mean, I had my students in town from Toronto the other day, and I took them to the Lloyd's of London. I think that's a building that we would look back. I think we'll look back at the moment like, oh, this building celebrates the fact buildings no longer breathe from themselves, that we require respirators for our architecture. It's a problem, and that's a kind of one of many kind of things that you could point to. A building that can't breathe for itself, in my mind, can't be green.
Adam, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it comes back to the honesty conversation, which is, I think there are too many examples that you can point to where they just aren't. They haven't stood the test of time, and there are some certifications that just don't perhaps focus broadly enough. I don't think a sweeping statement that any certified building is a green building is fair.
Yeah,
we're starting to run out of time a bit, and honestly, there's so many more aspects of both your talks that we could ask questions on. But to kind of conclude, I want to stay on the idea of messaging, because it's been a theme in a couple of these questions, and it's also a theme that in its own way came through in both of your talks. And I guess my overall question is, do we have a messaging problem around climate in architecture, in design, and in the media? And what I mean by that is, Kelly, in your talk, you showed the example of an article about I believe a housing project in Canada, which they described as sustainable, but as you pointed out, from an embodied carbon point of view, was not sustainable
It's
at
your
all.
house, no?
my own cottage.
Yeah.
Oh, it's your own cottage. Sorry. And
You're
you also mentioned timber. That timber is held up as I liked Adam's term, a timber bullet, which isn't necessarily true. And then, as an aside, there was a documentary by Michael Moore, the filmmaker, a few years ago called Planet of the Humans, and he criticized biomass energy, using wood pellets for energy, along the same lines that we don't pay enough attention to where the wood comes from, to all the damage done to biodiversity, etc. And Adam, as well, the theme of messaging was really strong with you as well. And in some ways, you actually highlighted, I think, good messaging in some point, which is around the hole in the ozone layer. That is a very tangible thing that people can look at and understand, okay, there's a hole in the ozone layer. That's kind of scary. And it reminds me of something I was thinking about the other day, about how I think in the 2030s, we might see an ice-free summer in the Arctic, that in the summer months, I think by 2035, along current trajectories, the Arctic might see an ice-free summer, which seems to strike home as a message different even to something like a 2 degree Celsius increase in global temperatures. Some people, I can forgive people for looking at that and thinking, so what, 2 degrees? Well, that's not going to affect my life. And so messaging, it came through a lot in different ways in your talk, but I'm just wondering, are we not that good at messaging around what the solutions are to the climate crisis, or what the approaches are in the climate crisis? Do we have a habit of holding up false solutions? And are we maybe sometimes a bit too abstract in our assessment of climate and in what we put forward as solutions? I don't know who wants to take that. What was the term, lightning rod of a question? But maybe Adam, or Kelly.
I mean, I'll just feel. I don't know. I think in some cases, yes. I think organizations like Passive House have been very good at getting the message out. And I think for doing a lot of good. I mean, don't misunderstand me. I think there's a lot about what they're trying to do that makes a lot of sense, but it depends, and in not all contexts, right? I think, but overall, also, it's exciting to see things like Retro First becoming a campaign, and Embodied Carbon. My friend Will and others, in the House of Parliament in the UK. These are all just UK specific, but globally, I'd say yes, this is really poorly understood as the impact of like that 40% buildings thing. When I first thought, I was like, wow, I've never thought about buildings as like the, almost half of the problem, and more so in cold climates like Canada. So I think that the messaging's out there, but I think in some ways it's not the full picture. And I mean, we're here today to hopefully color a more holistic view of what we're up against and how to go about addressing it.
Yeah, I'm going to turn to Adam, but Kelly, I'm actually glad you brought up Retro First, because I think that is another example of messaging done very, very well. Like Retro First, even as a title, it's very easy to understand. It goes to that line of the greenest building is the one that's already been built. And it's interesting that the Architects Journal, a media organization, were involved in the propagation of that. And so Adam, what are your thoughts on, and you touched on it in your own talk about some of the myths that are out there around climate. Are we doing enough to actually dissuade those myths?
Short answer, yes. And I think as an industry, I think we're quite certainly, where I'm working, and it sounds like where Kelly's working, it seems as an industry we actually are. I think, particularly in the last 3, 4, 5 years, there's been a rapid upskilling within the practices of knowledge. I think where we're perhaps falling short is actually people who are outside the industry, and their understanding of what the issues are and what they can do about it. We talk about not building, but we've got to double the number of cities we have in the next generation. So how are we not going to, do you know what I mean? We don't have it. What are we're not going to build? I think that's where the breakdown is. It's just, okay, there's this big problem. We all get it, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 10 degrees. None of it sounds scary, frankly. But what are we going to do? And the answer, frankly, is not, well, don't use a plastic straw, because that isn't going to solve the problem.
Yeah.
So I think that's our next challenge, right? Is to offer up, right, this is what it's about. And that's where, somebody mentioned Insulate Britain earlier. When you actually look at the data on Insulate Britain, you go, that's a big difference, right? On two fronts, on the reduction in demand, on the way it brings, it can help, improve the carbon output of the grid supply. That's a big thing. It's easy. It's simple. I think on this side of the world, that's something we should all be getting behind.
Yeah. And to that, to kind of back to your Bucky Fuller, I don't actually, I got to push back a little bit on him. I don't think we're going to build, we don't need more cities necessarily. I think on Earth right now, we have enough floor area for everybody. It's just it's not allocated correctly, right? And I just think, again, I'm in North America, I'm in Chicago right now, and I just went through my hometown, Winnipeg, on the way here. We've got more than enough floor area and space to house millions more people. And it's just, we haven't designed our cities and our architecture to think about it that way. I think there's exciting, in my mind, the future of our careers of understanding the infrastructure we have and reproportioning it to accommodate more people, or thinking about how to move some of it, and not digging more holes elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. To wrap up then, we're actually going to wrap up with a question that Cecilia, one of the first speakers, sent in to us. And it actually ties nicely to the question I wanted to ask anyway, which is about recommendations to people who are watching this. And what Cecilia asks is, do you have recommendations on low-cost approaches to get started? Because she says teams in the African context face challenges on initial capital. I want to pack that into the similar questions I asked at the end of the last Q&A session was, if you had one piece of advice to give to people who are watching this, whether now or afterwards, to take away from this, what would it be? So maybe Adam first.
Sure. I think to Cecilia's question, there's an easy one of use less stuff. I think what we have found a lot in our work is that what's good for carbon is good for cost, because it starts with designing things out. So I think that's an easy one, slightly tongue in cheek. I think more. I think more to the point is also about spending the time and energy on design, and not necessarily on the procurement side. I think if that's where the energy goes, then you've got much bigger levers over there. A little bit to Stephen's graph that he showed at the end. I don't know if you want to add to that, Kelly.
Well, absolutely. I'd say use less stuff and use stuff that's around you. I think that the greatest lesson that I learned in architecture was all in Rwanda, a landlocked country with an 18% import tax, which made us really look around immediately and use it and figure out new ways to use it, using earth, using stone, and in a way also look at how buildings were built 120 years ago, because they offer you more clues than the ones that were built 20 years ago. That would be my other basic piece of advice. And I'm looking out my window at the Chicago Auditorium that Lou Sullivan was involved in, and it's got giant granite stone foundations. These are that's back to first principles, and that no matter where you're from, I think that vernacular offers a lot of clues about the lowest carbon construction process.
Awesome. So with that, we're going to conclude today, and I want to thank again Adam, Kelly in this session, and also Cecilia, Rachel, Guan, and Stephen in the previous session for all the time they've given today. And just a reminder, this is only the first in 4 events which we have planned over the coming weeks. So next Wednesday, the 29th of June at 3 p.m. Kenya time, we're going to have another talk, 3 p.m. East Africa time, and it's going to be on the topic of digital twins. And same procedure, we'll have presentations from some guests, we'll have Q&As, we'll have panel discussions, and we hope you can join us. It's all going to take place here on our YouTube channel. Other than that, thanks a million for joining us today, and hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you.